let us go to the roll call.
So Bob McKay,
Here.
Jennifer Lemack, here. Doug Pirelli is sick and won't be able to join us. Daryl Andretti is here. Paul Stewart.
Here.
Chuck Bandry.
Here.
Kristen Merritt here. J.D. Lorenzo is, I expect him. We'll see. Wayne Aldridge, of course, is here. And Wayne Goodman.
Here.
And Lucy's also not able to make it. Okay.
This will be September minutes.
Kristen wants to, you
Yours.
want to make a?
Oh, I had a very small, kind of the minutes. There's I don't remember. There's
I misstated her.
the cemetery in Stony Brook. You mentioned the poetic. I think the poetic introduction, and my nuance there was I was so compelled by this nomination with telling the story of the residents, if you will, of the cemetery, and that one of them would walk from Long Island to the exact location where we were meeting, Phillips Manor Hall. So what I found poetic was that we were meeting in the place in which one of the cemetery residents used to walk this very long distance. So it's just my little nuance of that story that was so compelling to me. That's not very little. I can make it briefer.
Would you like to make the motion with the hope that the nuance can be included?
I can write it for you in briefer if that helps. But absolutely, I make that
I just want to say, I could not hear very well in that room, and so a couple places I found I had lost the thread of what was said, and I tried to fill it in.
The short version is it was poetic that one of the cemetery residents used to walk
to Phillips
Manor Hall, which is quite a distance.
But, yeah,
Your
so-
version was undoubtedly better.
Well, no, a couple places I went around, I said, you know,
Captured.
do you have any idea what this person was talking about? Because we were spread out, and that room was so echoey.
I do move
So
that.
anyway, I'm sorry.
No.
Okay, with that improvement, we have a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay.
Now,
We wanted to discuss the minutes, and I floated some dates, but I wanted to change. A couple people gave me times they could or could not be here. March 8th doesn't seem to work now that we have it. The staff had way preferred March 15th, which doesn't work because Jay and Daniel and Michael will all be in Washington at the lobby day. However, I was talking to Michael yesterday, and Bob also just mentioned the 8th doesn't work for him. And I don't want to put it off to the 22nd because that would give us a very short time between then and June. And then I would have to redo the whole calendar, whereas I had it every 13 weeks. So Michael said he wouldn't mind staggering in from being tired to do it on the 16th, which is the Friday. So would it be okay if we did it on Friday, March 16th? Does that pose a problem for anyone? We kind of have to know because, like, we did the 8th, the notification letters for districts have to go out December 22nd.
The
Which
16th
is a
sounds
problem. So the 16th would be way better for everybody.
Okay.
Does that meet your need? Okay, so then the other dates were June 7th, when we would have to do without Kristen, but everyone else could make it. And then September 6th and December 6th. And that would be an even 13 weeks, which would be best for staff. We wouldn't have a short period at the end again. And that would give us the awards in the first week of December, not putting them off till too late.
Could we have those dates again? June?
Okay, so it would be March 16th,
Yep.
June 7th, September 6th, and December 6th. And that works out to, whether it's just a shorter period between March and June, but we plan for that.
Perfect. Do you need a motion?
Well, no, just if you accept that, we'll go with that. You know, if something comes up, I think we'll have to change it, but we have to set the letter sending schedule right now because they have to be published and they have to be published in the state register. And if we could do March 16th, I think the staff would be really, really happy, and some of you would be happy.
Catherine, I just want to put in a plug for another site that we might meet at. You know, it is a very important function of this board, although it is not exactly part of our mission, right, to meet at these state historic sites, and it's an opportunity to for their staff to meet their regional directors and the whole People's Island contingent, and get things come out. The last meeting, I was pushing Grant's Cottage. This week, I would like to push planting fields. We have so many amazing friends groups around these state historic sites now. And the Planting Fields Friends Group, known as the Planting Fields Foundation, is clearly one of our flagship friends groups. And they have, within that great house, dedicated exhibit space. And this year, they're mounting an exhibit that's going to travel. And it is going to the New York Historical Society, and then up to Newport to the Art Museum. And it's on Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney and her sculpture and her marvelous studio, which survives in family hands, still owned in the family at Old Westbury. And we have had an indication from the family that they would be interested in talking about National Register status as you know, Catherine. So if there was an opportunity to meet at Planting Fields, see the exhibition before it begins to travel, and then arrange for a tour for this board and state staff to see the Delano design Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney studio, which is, for those of you who've seen it, it's a building you will never forget. It would be terrific. Now, obviously a lot of moving parts there. I don't know how all the schedules would mesh, but I think worth looking into. And if in concert with this exhibit, we could move the forward the National Register nomination of the studio this year, that would be a wonderful thing.
Yeah, I bugged the now owner, John LeCourtier, about National Register status for some time. It sounds as though they're more sympathetic. His mother died recently. And it's only about 20 minutes away from Planting Fields, I think, so it would be an easy combination to do. But I think that given the renewed interest in women's issues, women's rights, here was an early sculptress in the 20th century, a very independent-minded person and talented artist, and do no harm celebrating her life and her achievement too.
When is the exhibit going to start?
We're going to Henry Joyce is their director, and I think we're going to have to be in touch with him to on that score.
He's the director of Planting Fields.
It's the director of the Planting Fields Foundation. Anthony Smith is the director of the Arboretum, the state administrator. But Henry Joyce is the part of it. And I think with that, we are ready for the Deputy Commissioner's report. Welcome, John.
Good morning to the board, to the public, and to the staff of the Division of Historic Preservation, and thank you to the State Museum and State Library for hosting us today. Commissioner Rose Harvey will be joining the schedule later today. Not available this morning due to conflicts, and I'm delivering this report on her behalf. I wanted just to cover really sort of the year's work of the Division for Historic Preservation based out of People's Island. At the conclusion of this meeting, presuming successful reviews and approvals, we will have processed 88 National Register nominations. That volume of work is typical for this agency. We have more National Register nominations and more structures listed on the National Register than any other state in the country, and that pace continues. In 2017, the 88 nominations were approved from 37 counties, 56 municipalities, representing 19 historic district nominations and 69 individual listings, totaling 1,576 structures, including at least 11 religious properties, 7 cemeteries, 1 park, and 1 archaeological site. 78% of those nominations are from distressed census tracts, and properties within those tracts are eligible to utilize the state historic tax credit. So a very interesting volume of work there. The compliance staff, John Bonafide here representing the unit, over 8,800 project reviews processed so far this year. To date, under state and federal regulations and obligations, we have been consistently meeting project review timelines and really meeting review streamlining goals under Section 106 and Section 1409 of the State Historic Preservation Act. The tax credit program, this is an interesting issue right now because the federal tax reform legislation in both the House and Senate significantly impacts the existing federal rehabilitation tax credit program. Through 2016, we retained our #1 ranking nationally. We use the federal tax credit more frequently and at higher volume in this state than any other state in the country. $831 million of redevelopment projects focused on historic structures. We are on pace to match that total in 2017 as well. We've been ranked #1 for the past 3 years and expect to be ranked #1 in program use again in 2017 when the 2017 report comes out. There are 296 tax credit projects under review by staff at the State Historic Preservation Office. We're estimating $5.6 billion of economic redevelopment ahead should those projects proceed. What is at risk at the federal level is that the U.S. House has proposed eliminating this incentive for redevelopment of historic properties altogether, and the Senate bill version curtails that program. And we're working very aggressively with the governor's D.C. office, the lobby office in D.C., to protect this program, to get at least the Senate bill version passed in the reconciliation process. And as a component of that, we're working aggressively to propose enhancements to the state rehabilitation tax credit program. We thought those were going to augment enhance the use of the state credit and the federal credit together in New York State, and now we're beginning to look at that as possibly backfilling what we might lose at the federal level. State Historic Sites Program, we opened 3 new exhibits this year at Senate House, Schuyler Mansion here in Albany, and Schoharie Crossing State State Historic Sites, and convened just this fall a regional meeting that attracted over 80 organizations and scholars on Dutch cultural heritage, early Dutch heritage in New York State. And that will be a foundation from which to build cross-collaboration between organizations, scholarship, and both public and private Dutch heritage-themed sites, primarily here in eastern New York. And the final piece to add is that the solar installation on the roof of the People's Islands facilities will finally go online in early 2018. We're very pleased that our facility and the People's will be making a contribution to the state's renewable energy goals. So in summary, I just want to thank members of the public who are here today, who've made the effort to travel to Albany in support of significant nominations. I've had the chance to talk to several of you this morning. We appreciate the support you show for the national and state registered programs. We appreciate the support you have offered staff in advancing these nominations and forming these nominations. By your accounts, our staff is working well for you. I appreciate the comments and compliments you have passed on about our staff's work in support of these listings. And again, thank you for your time and effort to be here today. So thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. That's a terrific report. Any chance of sharing that by email with the state board?
Happy to do so. Kath actually already has a copy of it.
Great.
Yesterday.
Any specific report
Oh,
that I can,
yeah, those wonderful statistics are great to see.
we should be calling our representatives.
You should be calling your representatives, particularly if you live in a Republican House district.
And then we Michael, do we report from the election?
Good morning. I got a check. I'm glad that both Bob and Daniel mentioned the State Historic Site System, because what I want to do is briefly give you an overview of what the other part of the division has been up to this year. If you've been to a State Historic Site, you've only seen the tip of the iceberg. What the Bureau of Historic Sites and Parks does and manage is our collections. They do art conservation, they prepare interpretation exhibits, they do research to support all of that. So here's what we did this year. Collections. We continue to add to the collections at our state historic sites. Each state historic site has a collections policy, what we're looking for, which helps us winnow out what we don't want. Most of the new acquisitions come through donation, like this military uniform. But we do have a very small fund generated by the sale of objects that we no longer need in the collection, and sometimes we actually buy something. There was an auction of Alexander Hamilton related items. A multiple generation descendant of Alexander Hamilton decided to take advantage of the popularity of the Broadway play and put a bunch of documents on auction, and they sold for oodles and oodles of money. This, however, is a receipt for a haircut for Philip Schuyler and some hair-related objects like ribbons and powder and stuff. And nobody else cared because it didn't have anything to do directly with Alexander Hamilton. So we scored this at the bottom end of the, I guess, and added it to our collection. I can also mention that Schuyler Mansion, where Alexander Hamilton was married, has seen a significant increase in visitation since the play won all those Tonys and stuff. We don't just collect, we loan out our collections for others to use for exhibits, and we also borrow things from others for our own exhibits. I'm not going to, that's not quite in focus. I was
It's
hoping
the
I didn't have to
projector,
read.
Michael.
What?
It's the projector.
Oh, I was hoping I didn't have to read all those notes because I assumed you could read. I'm still not going to tell you what those say. Otherwise, I won't make my 10-minute go. One of the things that the staff at People's Island does is assist the regions with capital projects, restoration and repairs. Schuyler Mansion, when it was restored in 1917 by the State Education Department, they installed a large set of Zuber woodblock print wallpaper because we knew that there was woodblock wallpaper on the walls, but the pattern that was on those walls was no longer available. So they put something up, something really nice, something historic. But we wanted to restore it back to what it was. What it was the ruins of Rome. And there are two surviving complete sets of the ruins of Rome. One in the Lee Mansion in Marblehead and one in one of the historic rooms at the Met. So with high resolution digital photography, we documented all of those images, took them back to People's Island, manipulated them on the computer, adjusted for color and all of that, bought special rag paper, ran them through our very, very large scale printer, and digitally printed a copy of the wallpaper, and then installed it. So what it was is on the left, and what it is on the right. We saved over $40,000 using modern digital technology instead of the old-fashioned woodblock print. This is just in the central hallway, but it's both the first floor and the second floor. Now you might be wondering, what did we do about that old historic Zuber paper that was already on the walls? We didn't take it off because removing it could cause damage. So we created a system where there's an interlayer between the old wallpaper and the new wallpaper. The new wallpaper is hung over and in front of it, but not attached to the old paper. So it's still there. If somebody in the future decides they want to restore it to what it looked like in 1917, they can do that. But I won't be part of that. The labs, the conservation labs at People's Island are where the magic happens. New York State is the only state historic site system in the country that has its own conservation labs with objects conservators. We have 6 different types of object conservators. And the first rule of fine art conservation is do no harm. So here's a Dutch Delft tobacco container where the rim of the had been broken, a little infill, but in a way, and it's just with some plaster of Paris so it could be easily removed. No epoxies, no things that are permanent. and then in painting to make it less obvious where the repairs have been, so that when we put this on exhibit, the object that looked like that on the left now looks like that on the right. And it's much more easily understood by the visitor. Part of what our conservators do is to undo previous bad repairs. Scotch tape is bad for paper. We know it now, we don't use it now, but they used it all the time back then. So one, removing the tape so that it doesn't damage the underlying paper. Infilling all those little holes in places where the paper has either disappeared or the tape pulls it off. And then bleaching the paper slightly so it's less visible. A large part of preparing for exhibits is doing research. And as part of developing the new exhibit at the Senate House that Daniel mentioned, we had 79 documents in Dutch. We didn't know what they said, so we sent them out for translation just to find out whether there was anything interesting there. This document caught us by surprise. It's actually a list of clients by a cabinet maker in Kingston. Now, Kingston was burned by the British in September of 1777. All those households were destroyed. All those households needed to replace the objects that were lost. 22 different families were ordering from this one cabinet maker a kast, which is a traditional Dutch wardrobe kind of thing. So we now know who the clients were, and from this document, we now know who the cabinet maker was as well, which we didn't know before. So sometimes there's great surprises when we do research trying to answer one question, because this had nothing to do with the exhibit that we were preparing for the Senate House, which was on the 17th century. But there's an exhibit at the Huguenot houses in nearby New Paltz on cost. So this became a critically important document to be loaned out for that exhibit. One of the things that our conservators do, and sometimes the materials just can't be conserved. You can fix the paper, you can't fix this. And so it's not just a question of going from that to this with reupholstery. You have to custom fabricate the fabric. You have to match the color and the pattern. You have to source the tacks that are the right head. You have to source all that, I don't know what it's called, the trim. So it's a very complicated thing. It's not just about reupholstering a couch. Some things are really, really big. This is a tapestry at Mills Mansion. It requires as many handlers as one of the balloons at the Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade. And see that with ropes to lower it down. And very carefully, it has to be lowered down and rolled up so it can be put on the van and taken back to People's Island where it can be cleaned, the fabric stabilized. And then they had to do this in reverse, all the way back up. A large number of the hundreds of thousands of objects in our collection are archaeological elements. Little pieces of brick and little pieces of ceramic, each one gets counted. But before we put those on exhibit, a lot of them need conservation. This happens to be a horseshoe from Empire Stores in Brooklyn. And what it looked like when we dug it up out of the ground is on the far left. You got to remove all those accretions and then treat the remaining steels, or iron in this case, so that it doesn't corrode, and it looks fairly decent on exhibit. And here's, Daniel mentioned the Schoharie Crossing exhibit. These are pieces that were excavated archaeologically. They're part of the hardware, if you will, for the operation of the gates for the locks. They were conserved, cleaned, and then put into the exhibit. Not all of the objects can be brought to People's Island where the magic happens. Sometimes you have to go out to do it. So these are cemetery monuments at one of our state historic sites, military men buried on the site. Rather than lift those out of the ground and bring them back to People's Island, they were conserved in place. And one of the more interesting things that I think our staff has been working on this year is actually not a project for one of the state historic sites. Occasionally, we undertake work for other state agencies under contract. We're right now working on a series of 6 panels per bridge for the 5 major Hudson River crossings. And these talk about the history of crossing the river and the history of those specific bridges. So our interpretation unit is doing the research, they're doing the design, they're doing the graphics, and they're actually doing the production of these signs that will be one of the things the state is trying to do is encourage more pedestrian access on these bridges, and so these will be interpretive panels that you can stop and read as you're crossing the Hudson River on your bike or walking. don't stop at the top. So that's what the people, the other half of the staff at People's Island have been doing this week. So when you go to a historic site, whether it's for a city new board meeting or on your own, you're just seeing the tip of the iceberg. You know that all that back of house stuff up at People's Island, that's what these folks do all year. Questions?
Michael, have you gotten involved at all with the Jones Beach collection, all those wonderful signs that show in both design and letter what their purpose was? And
We're working with the Long Island region on the Jones Beach archives, but not the signage so much as the photographs and the records for the development of that. A lot of which has to do with Robert Moses.
Is there a plan to move that collection from where it is now?
There's a discussion about where to move it. There is a plan to move it from where it is because it's recognized that it's not the best location, but then there's a question of where is appropriate, and whether it's within the state system or whether we move to a local repository. But we still own it, but they store it because they have the right conditions, so that's under discussion. But there is a recognition that we shouldn't keep it where it's been all these years. Any other questions? Good. If not, I'll turn it back to Bob.
Good report. Proceed with your work.
Thank you, Mike.
Looking for nomination.
I'll bring this over to you. You want to sit here?
I'll say that. Excuse me.
Bill Kratzer is sick, and so I'm gonna follow through his presentations, begging your mercy, because he texted me his notes, and I'm gonna try. I tried to translate them into larger notes this morning, starting at 8:30, but I'm not sure I got them all. I also, what do we do, Virginia? Just go to the next one?
Yeah, just hit the arrow.
Yeah, I can't remember how many slides he has for each one, but I'm pretty familiar with the properties. And I'll tell you first of all right now that this is Dunnick's in the town of Cornwallville, which is in the village of Cornwallville, which is in the town of Durham, which is in the CLG, which we have a letter of support from, so I know that much. How many slides? I don't know how many slides he has. I'll just kind of have to wing it here. So Dunnick's is a wonderful property. It's the former home and property of the Matthews family. It's a rambling and architecturally distinctive main house, and it includes, in addition, it includes 2 mixed-use service buildings linked by a shallow arched breezeway, and a number of other historic ancillary buildings and landscape features. They all survive with a high degree of integrity to illustrate the early 20th century estate of the Matthews family. Now, this is 4 views of the house from the same location. The house is exhibits an idiosyncratic vocabulary resulting from multiple building campaigns, beginning with a fairly typical Greek Revival farmhouse, and then they added a variety of neoclassical and then arts and crafts inspired features in a highly creative way. Of particular note is this shows the estate, the 2 linked outbuildings, privy, and I think that is the water tower there. This is the dining room, which is remarkable, featuring an extensive quarter-sawn oak wall paneling and carved woodwork, which creates an exquisite and charming double-height space, all attributed to German-born artist and sculptor Karl Mueller, who was a son-in-law of the patriarch, John Mathers, the soda fountain king. Mueller also designed the senior Mathers grave marker. Do we have that? Nope. Okay, I guess that's all we have. Who designed the senior Mathers grave marker at Greenwood Cemetery. Even though Mueller died before this was installed at Dunnick's, there is a strong attribution that he had already completed the work before his death. The property is also notable for its collection of whimsical outbuildings, the service building with an engaged lighthouse feature, an ornate privy, a stone water tower, and 20 acres of land, which includes a golf course. It's significant in architecture and art. And Phil couldn't get a picture of that, but it is intact, that double height dining room space. Any questions about Dunnick's?
Wonderful property I nominated.
It's pretty spectacular.
Just in seconds, all in favor?
Aye.
We better get these in.
Okay. So next is the equally interesting and spectacular to me Vernoy Bevier House and Barns in Warwarsing, Ulster County. This is an 18th century New World Dutch stone house located in the New York 209 corridor. It's a story and a half stone house built of locally quarried limestone in a manner consistent with contemporary regional vernacular building practices. It was built in two distinct phases, an original one-room section and then a lateral expansion, which then gave it a rectangular plan. It's believed to have been built in circa 1750 and was expanded about 1775 or slightly later. And at that point, it received the central chimney, which served back-to-back fireplaces in the main first floor rooms. And it retains this late 18th century arrangement today. The interior retains massive exposed ceiling beams and two jammed hearths, one serving the kitchen fireplace. Upstairs, which was once opened, was later finished and partitioned into rooms. And there was that frame addition that you saw, which is no longer there. And then that was a possible summer kitchen. And then it also retains a remarkable collection of agricultural outbuildings from a later period representing the use by the Hornbeck family. And these form a tight farm cluster, including two timber frame barns from about 1875, a granary from 1895, an ice house, a chicken coop, and a pig barn. Historically, it's significant for its association with the region's early Dutch and French Huguenot population. We believe it was built about 1750 after the marriage of Jacobus Bevier and Anna Vernoy, and we know it was there during the Revolution. It's an outstanding example of an 18th century New World Dutch domestic architecture in the Hudson Valley, in rural Ulster County, and it retains the distinctive characteristics of roughly load-bearing limestone walls, story-and-a-half forms, deeply pitched gable roof, limited ornamentation, and heavily scaled ceiling beams. And that is, I think this is a really cool property. So any questions about this? There are some people think it's earlier, but Bill, who was an expert on stone architecture, does not.
I commend the description of the mother's handling of the very young children in that house during an Indian attack. I think every mother of young children ought to consider that when they have obstreperous young.
Which is moved to poll, you want a second? All in favor?
Okay. And then last, this is what I was trying to copy down when you were all gathering, so I'm less prepared about this, but it's the Whitehall Fire Station, which was built in 1912 and 1913, the main block, and then over to the right you see an addition from 1970. This is really interesting. It's a state-of-the-art fire station. It was built for motorized equipment only a few years after Manhattan and Boston were building stations for motorized equipment. And it was moved in 1932 due to the relocation of the railroad tracks. And at the time it was moved, they didn't move the hose drying and bell tower in part because they were transitioning to motorized sirens. The original section is actually fairly intact. It was designed by Vermont architect S.O. Burdick. It is significant because it is connected to the evolution and modernization of firefighting. The new station was built because they acquired They acquired, mechanized gas-powered Webb fire engine, and the procurement of which placed Whitehall on a par with much larger cities such as Boston and New York, which had pumper trucks in 1909 and 1910. And it coincided with other modernizations in the department. And it has lost its parapet and has replacement windows, but otherwise the interior is very intact. And Bill likes to point out that it is no longer safe to use the the pole that's still there. That the station was very important in Whitehall because Whitehall had suffered a number of devastating fires, so it attracted quite a bit of local attention when they got the new pump truck and the new fire station. And it now sits next to the Erie Barge Canal. Any questions about Whitehall?
Jay makes the motion, and Charles seconds. All in favor?
I think there was another letter of support, but what was it? From Warwarsing, sorry, from Town of Warwarsing. Any questions about this one? No? Did you pass it? Okay, this is mine. This is Earl Hall at Columbia University, and this is the 5th of 5 nominations we contracted for under our first LGBT underrepresented property or underrepresented community grant. We'll be doing 2 more under the second grant, which is just starting and is more focused on survey. Earl Hall has multiple levels of significance. It was built as an assembly hall with a gift from William Earl Dodge Jr., who hoped that the building would be used to further the spiritual life of the student body. It was open to those of all denominations or those with no denomination, and it was used as a meeting place for all sorts of clubs and student organizations, especially those with a social or religious purpose. Completed in 1902, Earl Hall was among the earliest college buildings erected after Columbia acquired the Morningside Heights campus and was part of Columbia College's expansion from a minor institution into one of the great universities of the world. It is significant first under criterion A in the area of education for its association with the development of Columbia University as a major institution of higher learning in America. Earl Hall is also significant under criterion C in the area of architecture as an important work by McKim, Mead, and White. The building fills a key site in Charles McKim's master plan for Columbia's campus. It's one of the 3 major institutional buildings at the center of the campus. Low Library is the centerpiece of the plan, and it's flanked by St. Paul's Chapel on the east and by Earl Hall on the west. Both of those buildings face the library, and all 3 buildings have monumental domes. Both the library and the chapel are already individually listed, and we have said the campus is NRE as a district, but we've never actually gotten around to list it as a district. Earl Hall is a handsome example of the firm's classical revival work, and some who happen to have graduated from UVA have pointed out its similarities to the Rotunda at UVA, which McKim, Mead, and White were working on in the same period as inspiration. So the period of significance for Earl Hall under criteria A and C in education and architecture is 1900-1902, reflecting its original design, construction, and program on the Columbia University campus. The building retains a very high level of integrity, both interior and exterior, and the interior is still characterized by the small office and meeting rooms it was designed to hold. Earl Hall is also significant under criterion A in social history for its early and significant association with Columbia's LGBT community. Columbia was the first university in the United States to have a gay student group, the Student Homophile League, founded in 1966 after 2 students had the idea to form a chapter of the Mattachine Society, an early gay rights group at Columbia. They had the support of University chaplain John Dyson Cannon, and on October 28, 1966, 3 students held an organizational meeting sponsored by Chaplain Cannon in the Dodge Room on the 2nd floor of Earl Hall. The Earl Hall location was appropriate as William Dodge had specified that the building be used to help students balance their intellectual, physical, and spiritual life. Given that homosexuality was severely stigmatized in the 1960s, and that gays were not just discriminated against, but labeled as deviants or sinners, the need for an advocacy group and a place of companionship or refuge for young people away from home was a critical need on university campuses. Despite university resistance, national advocates supported the group, and advocates and students fought hard to overcome the administration's objections. Finally accepted in 1967, the group was given offices and meeting space in Earl Hall. Leaders hoped to initiate discussion and dialogue about homosexuality, invite speakers to campus, integrate homosexualities into the religious life of the community, encourage gay students to accept themselves, and offer counseling services. Now, beginning in 1970, the Homophile League's successor organization, Gay People at Columbia Barnard, which also had offices at Earl Hall, began holding regularly scheduled monthly gay dances in the Earl Hall Auditorium, which is a beautiful space in the Dome. These dances grew into one of the most important gay social events in New York and eventually attracted large numbers of LGBT people from all over the city. By the 1980s, these dances, the first at an American university, drew well over 1,000 attendees. They were especially popular with younger men and with men who felt uncomfortable in gay bars and clubs. So the period of significance for Earl Hall for its association with LGBT history is 1966 to 1985, which begins with the first meeting to discuss establishing an organization and extends to 1985 to encompass the establishment, growth, and significance of the Earl Hall dances. The period between 1970 and 1985 is exceptionally significant for its association with the gay dances during the era just before the AIDS epidemic forever changed social life for gay men. The dances initially provided young gay people with a space to gather and socialize. However, over the next 15 years, their importance greatly increased. In 1981, the AIDS virus began its destructive path through the gay community. As the epidemic spread, the year 1985 marked a watershed in the understanding of the severity of the crisis in New York City and the nation. It was also the year in which AIDS became a national issue. The death of several gay celebrities from AIDS, notably Rock Hudson, the opening of Larry Kramer's play The Normal Heart, and other well-publicized events brought the enormity of the crisis to general awareness. In addition, in 1985, the drinking age in New York State was raised to 21, and most bars began requiring identification. However, the Earl Hall mixers, which were lax on checking IDs, remained welcoming to younger gay men and lesbians, accepting of everyone no matter how they looked or dressed, and were more low-key events than venues at bars, clubs, and discos. Thus, they remained an important, safe social space, and they played a vital role in bridging the gap between the early days of gay rights advocacy at Columbia and the AIDS-related political activism that became evident in the late 1980s. So that is the complicated history of Earl Hall, but anyone have any questions about that? We feel we need, because it's gone so far to the present, into 1985, we need to make a special argument for that period for NPS to approve it.
It is a McKimbey and White building.
It is a
Also,
McKimbey and White building, but it's the period of significance going up to 85 that we need to be very careful about. But Andrew Park wrote the form just very insisting that that's an extremely significant period for the LGBT.
So Kevin, at what level does the National Park Service need to, because when you say you have to make a special case to go into the 80s,
Say that again?
you were saying the National Park Service really needs this special case made.
It needs
for
to be
significance
exceptionally
be-
significant
so
the closer it is to the modern period.
What's the, this is more of an overall question. What's the criteria to identify that something's exceptional? I'm not questioning this one, I'm just in general, with
Well, it has to be
something going
well,
to the 80s.
It has to stand out in relation to other things of the period. It has to be documented. The more documentation, the more it's written up, the more testimony you have. But something like this wouldn't necessarily be written up. Right. When we did Stonewall, for example, we used the testimony of people who were at the event and what it meant in their lives. And that's what Andrew is trying to get more interviews and stuff. The testimony, well, there was one in here, this was the first time I danced with a boy, and this was the song, and it stayed with me ever since. So the importance of the event in people's lives. Because it's hard to document some of these social history sites that haven't been written up by scholars yet. They usually like scholars evaluating it, but in sites like this, you don't have, scholarly attention.
And you certainly believe there's enough, he's made enough of a case that it'll
We've
find.
tried.
Yeah.
The Park Service has been fussier lately than they've been in the past. But we did have one in Jennifer's where's Jennifer? Jennifer's, what was the district,
It's
Jennifer?
the Fargo Estate neighborhood in
That
Buffalo.
had an AIDS-related
AIDS history
events
in the
that
80s.
went up to
so
1985, and they did accept that. But we've tried, we wanted to try to, Andrew was insistent that the significance should go to 85, which was the height of the, you know, the pinnacle of these dances. And so we tried to look for as much information to key it to 1985 as possible. So we came up with these things like the normal heart, and also I think the drinking age is pretty significant because that eliminated a lot of other places where these young people could go, and they weren't checking IDs on campus, and so that remained a place for the younger people who weren't necessarily as interested in the bars and discos and that sort of thing. So we're making the best case we can. I want to beef it up a little bit more before we send it down.
Jennifer moves it.
Chris-
Do you need a second?
Christie moves, I'll second.
Debbie, sorry. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you, and Bill thanks you.
Alright. So the Niagara Machine and Tool Works factory is a good representative example of a large-scale tool and machine factory designed and built during the first half of the 20th century. The Niagara Machine and Tool Works factory is significant under criterion A in the area of industry as one of the oldest and most important tool and manufacturing facilities in Buffalo during the 20th century. Its products were used nationally and internationally across industries. It is also significant for its contribution to the manufacturing of tools and machines for working sheet metal, specializing in presses, punches, and rotary sheets for government defense contracts. The company had orders from the federal government during World War I and World War II, and it was during World War II that the company established itself as an important defense contractor. The company had government orders for regular products in addition to equipment for the many significant international aircraft manufacturers such as Curtiss-Wright, Bell, Lockheed, Douglas, and 23 different foundries who used the company's presses to manufacture small parts for aircraft assembly both during and after World War II. The factory complex is further significant for its association with the industrial development of the east side of Buffalo along manufacturing nodes of the Beltline Railroad, which you can see sort of at the rear of those buildings there during the early 20th century. So here's a view. So the complex is also significant under criterion C in the area of architecture as a good representative example of evolving industrial architecture, architectural and engineering trends, innovations, and developments during the 20th century. The Niagara Machine and Tool Works factory is a good example of early 20th century factory design, with the original buildings designed by the noted Buffalo architectural firm of Green and Wicks, and later buildings and additions designed by local civil engineers H.E. Plummer and Jacob Fruchtbaum. Development of the factory complex occurred between 1910 and 1981, although the last building campaign that can be considered architecturally significant was completed in 1967, which coincides with the final piece of the factory's post-World War II and Cold War expansion. The nomination boundaries encompass 3 contributing buildings: the main factory, the pattern storage shed, and the machine shop, as well as the Beltline spurs, which are still present and enter actually into the buildings, sort of indicated on that drawing there. Like many factories from the late 19th and 20th centuries, the main factory, which housed offices and staff spaces, was designed so that it presented a more architecturally sophisticated administration portion, and it concealed the functionally designed production spaces. The factory incorporates key advances in factory construction of the period, such as the use of increased daylight, with its large window openings and sawtooth monitor roofs. It also employed modern fireproof construction materials. Advances in early 20th century operations for mass production incorporated management science, and the assembly line is evidenced in the layout of the plan in its 2 primary buildings. So a few interior reviews here. So the three business partners formed the company in 1872 in downtown Buffalo to manufacture household items such as refrigerators. As they changed ownership and grew, ultimately the company incorporated and named itself the Niagara Machine and Tool Works Factory in 1901. First located downtown, it moved to the edge of the Fruit Belt neighborhood in Buffalo's east side in 1894, and ultimately to the Northland Corridor area in 1910, where large swaths of land and a node to the Beltline Railroad offered the perfect location for expanding industry. Like many factories, including its neighbors, it evolved over time as both technology and manufacturing capacity were expanded and national war and defense needs increased. As a result, the main factory building was expanded with many additions. While some of the additions were carefully planned and executed by our architects or engineers, others were added as needed and as expansion dictated. It's really a group of buildings designed from the inside out, where interior function dictated the form of the exterior. So a few more views, which are spectacularly photographed, I'll have to say. So we have a very enthusiastic letter of support for the project from the Buffalo Preservation Board. We also just received a letter of support from the Buffalo Urban Development Corporation as well yesterday. And the consultant for the project, Barbara Companion, is here today. Barbara, you want to say a few words about the project?
Thank you, Jennifer. I just want to thank Jennifer and CAP for their amazing support and collaboration with this project. It's been a very complicated project. It's one piece of many other buildings in this neighborhood. And I don't use this term lightly, but this project is a game changer for the city of Buffalo and for the transformation of the east side of Buffalo, which has always been the most distressed area in Buffalo in the past, say, 40, 50 years. This complex alone, the one building, this headquarters building, is 235,000 square feet. It's been vacant for over 10 years. It's surrounded by other factories that have been vacant for up to 40 years. The city of Buffalo, through its development arm and current owner, the Buffalo Urban Development Corporation, or BUDC, bought all of these properties in this neighborhood and has been working very closely with the federal government and the state government, particularly with the governor's office. And we have 3 allocations of grants from the Buffalo Billion program through the governor's office that's being funded to us for this project from through ESD. It's what makes it, as an architect and consultant, what makes this really exciting, in addition to the fact that it has the support of the federal, state, and local governments, is that we are converting this complex into another complex that reuses and reactivates all of its character-defining features. So while I live in one of those factory buildings that's become lofts, which is fantastic, we are keeping this as a light manufacturing facility. There's a new school that's going in here, a workforce training center that will occupy half of the facility, and it's being created between a really interesting collaboration of the city, Catholic Charities, Goodwill, Buffalo Urban League, Erie County Community College, and Alfred Community College. The governor expects it to open on August 1st of 2018, and we just started it about a year ago. It's an incredibly ambitious and rigorous schedule and project. In addition to the first phase of the project, which is the Workforce Training Center, where we are able to reactivate and restore all of these incredible windows and sawtooth monitors. Some of them, the heights of the space are 40 feet, and we're able to keep that because we're reusing it as the type of space it was built for. It's becoming really a community changer. There's going to be a cafeteria, a cafe, a fitness center in that little red shed, a new cultural center and gallery that we are creating, a new nonprofit. It's really the seed to renew this entire neighborhood. And I just think, as somebody who lives in New York State, and all of us who live and work in New York State, this is the kind of project that we should be really proud of. Right now, as of last night, and this keeps changing, it is a $115 million project. $35 million of that is coming from the Buffalo Billion program through the governor's office. $15 million is coming from New York Power Authority. We're also getting historic tax credits, hopefully, new market tax credits, and brownfield tax credits. So because this is one piece of a much bigger neighborhood, much of which outside of this building involves Section 106 compliance, I also just wanted to acknowledge John Bonafide and Sloan Bullough, and then Julian Adams. I mean, everybody, and Jennifer and Kat. I mean, this is an incredible project, an incredible team, and the SHPO staff has just been really wonderful collaborators. So thank you, Budsy thanks you, and as you can tell, the entire team, everybody in the city is really excited about this project.
Barbara, the story that you did a very effective job with your documentation.
Thank
You did a good job of telling the story, so.
Thank you. It was really hard. It was-
Yeah.
And they were,
Complicated.
Jennifer was really helpful.
It's not an easy building to describe,
No.
that's definitely for
And
sure.
you did get
So
the story across.
Thank
Barbara did a wonderful job putting together a very complicated nomination for the building.
I make a motion.
Wade, do you want to say a second? All in favor? Aye. Barbara, thank you, and wow.
Thank you.
We can't wait, maybe we'll have our meeting there sometime.
We're going to wait for the cafe.
Yes.
So Ingleside Home provides a substantial contribution to the history of women, social work, and the healthcare industry during the 20th century in Buffalo. Although the organization, established in 1869, had operated in several other locations in the city, including an earlier building on this site, the nominated building, built in 1929, was the first and only building specifically constructed for the institution. The building was constructed at a pivotal moment of the organization when it shifted its mission from focusing on social reform to more about providing women's health services and domestic refuge for those in need. So initially founded as the Ingleside Home for Reclaiming the Airing, the organization underwent several transformations during its substantial history of operation, from its founding in 1869 to its closing in 1976. It began as a place of social reform, providing detoxification and refuge for what it determined as erring women associated with activities deemed socially unacceptable, such as prostitution, promiscuity, and alcoholism. But in 1923, the organization shortened its name to the less critical Ingleside Home to better reflect its new mission and program, which provided medical care, counseling service, and domestic refuge for unwed pregnant women and their babies. At this time, the institution required a new building that included both a medical wing and enhanced residential facilities for residents and staff in order to better serve this new mission. The design and construction of the new building represents the organization's dedication to and associations with women's health care. One design feature that reflects this was the secondary side entrance off of the circular driveway, which provided a measure of privacy for patients entering the facility. This is actually a view showing the main entrance, which is on the sort of on the side of the building. So for its associations with Ingleside Home, it's significant under criterion A in the areas of health, medicine, and social history. So in 1929, the building at 70 Harvard Place in Buffalo was designed by Frederick C. Backus specifically to provide facilities for the organization's expanded medical service in combination with the dormitory accommodations for the female residents and patients at Ingleside Home. The purpose-built space, which replaced an earlier building used by the home on the same site, reflects the intricate relationship between the architecture and the organization it contained. Evidence of the institution's mission can be seen in physical spaces designed to provide medical care and residential accommodations, most notably in the second floor hospital wing and in the dormitory layout, which is still present on the second and third floors of the building. Ingleside Home is a good representative example of a colonial revival style institutional facility meeting the requirements for criterion C in the area of architecture. And the period of significance here begins in 1929 with the construction of the building and ends when the institution closed in 1976. I'll just note this is a tax credit project, so we do have an approved Part 1 on this, so this is Ingleside Home. Are there any questions or comments on this one?
Jennifer, you want to do it?
Yes.
Jay seconds. Hopefully that ivy's not structural.
Yeah, hopefully not.
In that case, all in
They'll
favor?
find out. So this is the Westminster House Clubhouse, which is a mouthful to say, but is the most appropriate name we could really determine for this building. So it's significant as one of the only remaining buildings affiliated with the settlement house movement located in Buffalo. As such, the building provides a substantial contribution to the history of social work and institutional architecture during the late 19th and early 20th century. The organization, known as Westminster House, was established in other existing houses and buildings at this location beginning in 1894, and the nominated building was built to serve as a clubhouse for social and recreational activities. The clubhouse formed the nucleus for the organization's programmatic activities where most of the classes and events occurred. Housing for residents was primarily located in 3 other pre-existing wood-framed houses adjacent on Monroe Street and on Adams Street that have now all been demolished. The clubhouse building was thus one of 4 institutional buildings that compose the Westminster House organization. However, it is the only building commissioned and constructed specifically by the organization. The period of significance begins with the construction of the building in 1909 and ends when the institution and the surrounding community it served experienced substantial changes in 1962. After 1962, Westminster House underwent a significant change in leadership when it merged with the umbrella organization of the United Way. The building, designed by an unknown architect around 1909, served as the clubhouse for the Westminster organization. Established by the Westminster Presbyterian Church congregation, which is located in Buffalo's wealthy Delaware Avenue Historic District, Westminster House operated as a settlement house on Buffalo's east side, an area dominated by immigrant communities. Associated with the International Settlement House movement, Westminster House conducted extensive community outreach within the surrounding neighborhood, as well as offering educational and recreational programming at the clubhouse on Monroe Street. The institution aimed at integrating the surrounding German immigrant community of the neighborhood with the house's middle-class social workers by providing residential opportunities for full-time workers at Westminster House, as well as encouraging nearby residents to visit the facility through a combination of outreach, classes, and special events. Westminster House was one of the first organizations associated with the settlement house movement established in Buffalo, and the building is perhaps the only settlement house of this kind remaining in the city today. The building is a good representative example of this type of social work facility and the values that it embodies, meeting the requirements of Criterion A in the area of social history. So the clubhouse building was one of 4 institutional buildings, as I've noted, that comprised the Westminster House organization, and was the only one specifically commissioned by the organization. The purpose-built spaces reflect the relationship between the architecture and the organization it contained. Evidence of the institution's mission can be seen in the numerous large rooms designed to provide shared spaces for workers and neighborhood residents. It contains a large gymnasium, kindergarten classroom, dance hall, and library, and those are some of the most distinctive spaces within the building, exemplifying Westminster House's programmatic initiative to provide both educational and recreational outreach to community members. The Westminster House Clubhouse retains a high level of integrity and is a good representative example of an early craftsman-style institutional facility, meeting the requirements of Criterion C in the area of architecture. So some of the remaining features, this is the gymnasium down in the lower right corner, the auditorium on the upper right corner. Even down in the basement, there's evidence that there were meeting rooms. There's still a bowling alley that exists in there too. So it was definitely a very full-service, active hub for the local community. So again, this is also a tax credit project, and we have an approved part 1. So this is the Westminster House Clubhouse. Are there any questions on this?
Paul moves it, and Lee seconds. All in favor?
And last but not least, the West End Historic District in Springville. So the West End Historic District is significant under Criterion A in the area of community planning and development for its associations with the growth and development of the village of Springville, and under Criterion C in the area of architecture as an intact enclave of residential and religious architecture spanning roughly a century of development. So the district encompasses the residential neighborhood that grew up west of Springville's village center during the 19th and 20th centuries. Once an area outside of the main settlement of Springville, the neighborhood began developing in the mid-19th century, reaching its fullest growth around the turn of the 20th century. The middle to upper middle income family setting and feel of the West End Historic District ensemble is distinctly different from Springville's East Hill Historic District, which was reviewed by this board in 2015, located east of the Central Business District, where principally features large, high-style estates of the most prominent civic and social leaders of Springville. So just to give you a sense of where this is located compared to some of the other areas that have been designated, the blue circle indicates the commercial historic district that was designated on the National Register in 2002, the East Hill district that was reviewed in 2015, and now the West End neighborhood over in the red circle area there. So the district encompasses the residential neighborhood that grew up west of Springville's village center during the 19th and 20th centuries. Closer to the railroad, the West End was originally considered the less desirable area of the village in its early days. However, the area of the village became a center for residential development in the late 19th century due to West Main Street's proximity to businesses and amenities at the commercial core of Springville and North Central Avenue's connection to the industry along Springville to the south and the Springville-Boston Plank Road to the north. The West Side's golden age occurred after the 1878 opening of the Springville and Sardinia Railroad, which you can see in the drawing. It's sort of that line right to the side of the red circle there, which ushered in an area of increased rail-borne economic prosperity for the community. This development helped spur the growth and settlement of the western areas of the community and made Springville a bustling economic, industrial, and cultural center for southern Erie County. By about 1920, the West End Historic District had reached the final phases of its growth, as much of the land along Main Street and Central Avenue had already been subdivided and developed. The individual ownership of automobiles also indicated a shift in the location and type of residential development in and around the village, encouraging subsequent growth in new peripheral neighborhoods that were now accessible to downtown Springville. Accommodations for this new mode of transportation were made in the East End or the West End Historic District, as barns and carriage houses were transformed into automobile garages and new garages were constructed. Several of the buildings received minor updates, including new siding and replacement windows, and a few buildings have since found new use as commercial properties. Yet despite change, the district remained a center for the area, which is reflected in the construction of the most recent and most substantial church building and school and the post-war baby boom in 1950. The district buildings are associated with Springville's successful railroad capitalists, as well as its middle-income merchants, farmers, professionals, and also reflect national trends in residential architecture. The district includes examples of the Italianate and Gothic revival styles of the mid-1800s, large and grand Queen Anne and shingle style buildings in the late 19th century, an example of colonial revival style from the early 20th century. The small district also includes several churches and a former burial ground reused as a public park. While many properties appear to have been built by local builders and carpenters, likely using pattern books as their inspiration, several of the larger properties may have been designed by architects given their detail, complexity, and the social standing of their owners. However, the names of these architects are currently unknown. So this project was funded by a Preserve New York grant, a program of NYSCA and the Preservation League. We do have one letter of objection from a property owner and one letter of support from 2 property owners. This is the West End Historic District in Springville. Are there any questions on that? I know, he wanted to.
Is there a question? Your question? Jay's consent?
Yes.
All in favor?
And Clinton wanted to say a few words, but he wanted to say them after the board voted. So.
Mr. Chairman, without and suspenders. My name is Clinton Brown. We're the consultant. Jill Nowicki in our office worked on this. I'm here on behalf of Mayor William Krebs, who has won twice running for Village of Springville mayor on an historic preservation plan. How many mayors win decisively on historic preservation plans? I would also like to say that we're here because of Kathy Howe. Kathy Howe's initial work in Springville, how many years ago, helped teach Springville what it didn't know, and that it is a really significant place. And Jennifer, Kathy got elevated to the mothership here from the private sector, and so did Jennifer, and Jennifer hasn't missed a beat helping communities translate this information into national registers. So we want to thank Kathy, Jennifer, and Kath LaFranc for making this possible. Just on a personal note, this will mark Clinton Brown Company's 5,800th resources in the National Register of Historic Places. Sort of a milestone for us. We have another almost 2,000 in the pipeline. But I do want to say I've been at this business of historic preservation for almost 40 years. And with Daniel McKay and J.D. Lorenzo and Wayne Goodman and the other leadership through the CLG program, the Preservation League, and the Landmark Society, none of this would be possible. And over that 40 years, I think this is the best staff we've ever worked with and the best group of leaders we've had. And I wanted to put that on the table because you may not hear that enough. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you. Ms. Klein.
Thank you.
You will be part in honor of the development of Novocaine in this community. I think of it every time I
Can we get the mayor to think about higher
I don't know, it's written Novocaine. I guess,
It will be his second retirement after a career teaching history in school.
back, yes.
Good morning, everyone.
I have a chair.
Do some little chocolate here.
We'll sit back
Moving
down.
on to the meeting. I'm going to have to come back. Sorry?
Wait, we don't have a quorum at the moment.
Oh, okay. I was supposed to do all that.
7, okay.
I won't come up with any jokes.
I guess 7.
Jimmy, do have one.
I guess 7's okay, yeah.
Okay.
Don't anybody move. The others come back. Or else we'll
My very first project, you're going to get a little preview on it, but the consultant is rushing here and it's not here yet. Oh, leave you here. Okay, perfect. Perfect. So, sorry about that. We're set to go. Okay, so this is the Kingston City Alms House, which was primarily constructed between 1872 and 74. It's significant under Criterion C for its Italian design and as a representative example of the work of architect John A. Wood. After merging with Rondout to become the city of Kingston, the community had the resources to establish an almshouse to care for its aging and impoverished residents. While planning for the building, Kingston's Almshouse Commission studied other almshouses in the region, as well as publications of reformers advocating for better facilities and living conditions. Wood, a prolific mid-Hudson Valley architect during the 19th century, began his career in Kingston during the early 1860s. Wood became known for his ecclesiastical, hotel, and institutional designs, and had designed Poughkeepsie's Almshouse shortly before he was commissioned by Kingston. Wood's design for the Kingston Almshouse offered a tripartite design with simple but bold Italian details, including bracketed porches, window hoods, a decorative cornice, and shallow gables emerging from flat roofs. The building's minimal design, which was largely characterized by its fenestration, reflects the architect's interest in maximizing its functionality and keeping costs down for a municipal client while creating a building that was still attractive to the city and nearby residents. The almshouse is additionally significant under Criterion A in the area of social history for its association with the City of Kingston's efforts to care for its poor and aging citizens. Once completed, the almshouse offered housing for 150 to 200 people and was praised for its design, which allowed for plentiful light and air, and its practices such as separating the sexes and maintaining clean, pleasant, and sanitary facilities. Located on the edge of the city, the almshouse was surrounded by lawns and agricultural fields, which provided both meaningful work and recreation for residents. The almshouse also reflects shifts in healthcare and social welfare practices from the late 19th to the mid-20th century. The facility remained open until 1948, one of the last almshouses in the state, when it was repurposed as a county infirmary. And in addition to the main almshouse building, the property really is notable for having so many of its outbuildings remaining, including the laundry house there at the bottom right, the barn, brick office and garage, and this lovely stone cottage you can see at the top there. So we do have a letter of support from Kingston's mayor, Stephen Noble, a resolution of support from Ulster County. We have an approved part 1 on this, it's a tax credit project, and we have Lee here in the audience if you'd like to say anything on behalf of the project.
Hi, I'm Leah Rossetti. I'm with Heritage Consulting Group. I'm here on behalf of REPCO to express their support of this project. REPCO is planning to redevelop the site as affordable housing using both historic tax credits and low-income housing tax credits. So us, the project team, we really feel that this is going to be a compatible use for the site. and they're hoping to restore the interior of the main almshouse building to its former grandeur. So, thank you for your time, and I'm here if you have any questions.
Questions? Motion, Chuck seconds, all in favor?
You have a second, I'm sorry.
On to something very different. We have the Smith Ransom Japanese Bridge, which is located on Shelter Island. It was built circa 1905 as an ornamental landscape feature on the summer estate of Francis Marion Smith, the owner of the Pacific Coast Borax Company. Designed by engineer and inventor Ernest Ransom, the bridge is significant under criterion C for its architectural design and engineering, but and reinforced concrete construction. The bridge exemplifies Ransom's innovative methods, but the delicate Japanese-inspired design is unusual among Ransom's commissions, which primarily focused on more industrial buildings. The structure and an adjoining concrete seawall around a designed lagoon are the only surviving trace of Smith's turn-of-the-century estate, whose principal buildings were damaged or destroyed in the hurricane of 1938, and somewhat of a testament to the strength of the material. Ransom, an English inventor, engineer, and architect whose father had patented a process for producing artificial stone in the 1840s, brought his experience working in the family factory when he immigrated to the United States in 1870. Ransom began experimenting with reinforced concrete and secured a patent for his system of construction in 1884. Smith hired Ransom to build his West and East Coast borax factories out of reinforced concrete in 1889 and 1897, with very little of those remained. The bridge was designed and built at the height of Ransom's career, incorporating the inventor's signature Ransom bars, and the twist along the length of the bar contributed to a stronger bond between the metal and the concrete. The design for the bridge embodied the taste for Japanese culture during the late 19th century. Graceful in its contours and essentially ornamental in purpose, the bridge and lagoon serve as an analog to the popular Japanese garden. And although it's deteriorated a little bit over time, the bridge and lagoon remain as a rare, early, and unusual example of Ransom's work. So the draft you saw was by Zach Studenroth, who I know you all know very well. The letter, we do have letters of support from the Shelter Island Historical Society in the town of Shelter Island. And we do have a representative here, Katie Brewa, who's on the board of the Smith Ransom Japanese Bridge Conservancy. So if you'd like to speak on behalf.
Hi, thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, all of you. My name is Katie Brewa, and I'm here because my great-grandfather was Francis Marion Smith, and I grew up on Shelter Island. I no longer live there anymore, but I like to visit. And one of my last visits about 4 years ago, I came across the bridge, which is totally falling apart. And actually, you can pick the pieces of concrete they chip off. So we have learned that we either have to tear it down, or we have to rebuild it. And there have been efforts to patch it throughout the years. My grandmother, who's the daughter of Francis Marion Smith, has tried to help with that process. But now we're looking at a 250-plus project. And in order to do that, we set up a 501c3. And we are looking to, it's a collaborative effort between my family and the South Florida Hills Association. And we just really thank you for your time. And this is sort of a dream come true. This is the only legacy of my great-grandfather. And it's a very special project to me and to the people on Shelter Island. Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you all of you.
Thank you, thanks for coming today. Kristen being the one out.
And it was such an interesting read, too, about the bridge, so I absolutely will.
And the borax part.
And the borax part, so interesting.
Daryl's gonna say. All in favor?
Aye. Thank you. Moving on, this is the Ridgewood Reservoir, which is significant under criterion C in the area of engineering and criterion A in the area of community planning as the last surviving intact component of the first great infrastructure project undertaken by the city of Brooklyn, the building of a water supply system from the south side of Long Island to the homes and businesses of her citizens. After the region's water supply was threatened by private ownership and control, the cities of Brooklyn and Williamsburg and the town of Bushwick consolidated in 1853 in large part to begin establishing a large public water system. Long Island presented the best source of reliable water. The Ridgewood water system stretched from ponds and streams in Massapequa to a distributing reservoir overlooking Prospect Park and into the water mains under the city of Brooklyn. And so I love this map. Just to give you a sense of what you're looking at, this is one long map. So this matches up with this. There's no way to fit it. So here's the reservoir, and then everything else you're seeing are all the connections to the other water sources and the mains underneath the city. James P. Kirkwood was the chief engineer for the project, and H.S. Wells was the primary contractor. The construction of the entire water system, including the Ridgewood Reservoir, additional storage reservoirs, conduit, pumping station, and the distribution system under the streets of Brooklyn, was constructed in only 2.5 years. It was an inspiring feat of engineering. The reservoir began filling in November of 1858, and residents began enjoying fresh water direct to their homes the following January. In April 1859, the city staged a massive celebration, complete with a 5-mile-long parade, and of course the dedication of a new ornamental fountain in front of City Hall. The city's thirst grew rapidly, tripling in size between 1862 and 1871, making it necessary to construct a third, larger basin in 1891. The water provided by the reservoir allowed for the city of Brooklyn to grow from 96,000 in 1850 to 806,000 in 1890, to become the third largest city in the country. The water supplied the steam engines that made Brooklyn an industrial powerhouse and allowed it to become the largest beer-producing city in the United States during the late 19th century. Very important. Although the city's population and industry continued to grow, the water system had reached the limit of its capacity. By merging with New York in 1898, Brooklyn was able to reserve its long-term water needs. In 1917, the Ridgewood Reservoir was directly connected to new reservoirs in the Catskills, supplementing the supply from Long Island. After additional sources were added to the system in 1951, the Ridgewood Reservoir became redundant. The reservoir's 3 stone-faced basins collected the water for distribution throughout Brooklyn, and the water flowed from the reservoir for a full century, from 1859 to 1959, when it was officially designated a reserve supply. Over the past half-century, nature has reclaimed the reservoir, but its significance remains evident. So we have letters, lots of letters from Congresswoman Nydia Velasquez and Grace May, State Senator Joseph Adarvo, State Assemblymember Kathleen Nolan, Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams, Queens Borough President Linda Katz, 34th District Council Member Antonio Reynoso, 37th District Council Member Rafael Espinal, Landmarks Preservation Commission, New York City Parks, Queensboro Historian, Brooklyn Historical Society, the Brooklyn Chapter of the AIA, the Cypress Hills Local Development Corporation, the Ridgewood Property Association, the Brooklyn Bird Club, and about a dozen local residents and supporters. We do have some people here on behalf of the project today. Matt Molina from New York City H2O, which has been the sponsor of the project, and Steve Fiedler, who's the Parks Committee Chair for Community Board 5. So I'll turn the floor over to them. Have another sip of tea.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Matt Molina. Thank you for having us. Thank you, Jennifer, for all your partnership and your direction in completing the application. I'm the director and founder of NYS H2O. We're a nonprofit that provides education programs about New York City's water system and nature, and how New York City relies on nature to give us clean water. We have brought over 3,000 students to the Ridgewood Reservoir over the past 4 years to teach them about the importance of maintaining a good environment to provide us with clean water. We work with kids from grades 2 through 12, and the response that we get from students is inspiring from all the ages. Just a couple weeks ago, I was walking with a 4th grade student there, and she said to me, "This is a wonderful place, full of nature. Usually I'm allergic to nature, but now that I'm learning about it, I like it. I'm not allergic." The Ridgewood Reservoir is a majestic place that well deserves to be listed on the national and state historic registers as a cultural and ecological treasure to be discovered by generations to come. Thank you.
I will be very brief. I've been on this for about 16 years now, trying to keep the Parks Department from developing it. At one time, they wanted to put construction waste into all 3 basins and make baseball fields and artificial turf fields. Then, when it was labeled high sea hazard by the state DEC, because of a catastrophic event, if it filled up with water, it would flood Jamaica Avenue. We proved to them that when we had Hurricane Andrew, which was a complete rainstorm, there was only 1.1 inches of water in the basins. So we got it lowered to a low A. City of New York wanted to breach the walls to have water run from 3 to 2, 2 to 1, and then out into the city sewer system with $9 million to do that, all right? We fought very hard to stop that. We called the governor. The governor tasked Venetian Lannon at that time, who was in charge of Region 1 DEC. We had a nice meeting, and on that meeting, everything started to go in our favor to keep it nature, okay? There's not a lot of places like this in the city of New York anymore where you can actually walk around a basin of water, okay, enjoy nature, not hear any cars or any horns or any sounds. It's very, very nice, and I appreciate everybody here to help us out so we can keep it nature for the kids and the community. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Yep. Any questions? Well, since I was born in Brooklyn, it's probably a conflict, but I'm going to move it. Darrell, second. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you.
We appreciate it.
Sit down and stuff. Okay. So this is the Old Town Flushing Burial Ground, also known as Martin's Field, and it's locally significant under Criterion A in the areas of ethnic heritage and social history for its role as the primary burial ground that served the African American and Native American community in Flushing during the 19th century. Used between 1840 and 1898, the burial ground is the final resting place for approximately 1,000 individuals. The village initially established the site as the public burying ground for victims of contagious disease and for use as a potter's field. Prior to 1881, many of the individuals buried at the site died during smallpox and cholera epidemics. Many of those buried here were among Flushing's poorest citizens, with a large percentage of African American and Native American descent. By 1898, the cemetery had been built. Over the next several decades, the site fell into disuse, and the growing village struggled with what to do with the land. In 1914, after the village's proposal to reopen the cemetery for burials was rejected by local residents, the village of Flushing sold the land to New York City Parks Department for use as a public park. At that time, 4 headstones remained on the land, and you can see them there on the map toward the bottom. This history appears to have been forgotten by 1936, when the city installed a playground on the southern portion of the land, where stones had been located, and discovered buried remains in the process. In recent years, local groups, notably the Old Town of Flushing Burial Ground Conservancy, have worked in collaboration with New York City Parks and local politicians to reinstall the playground in a more appropriate location and recognize the history of the site as an early and predominantly African and Native American burial ground in Flushing. I do have letters of support from the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission, New York City Parks, the Queens Library, State Senator Tony Avella, and of course the Old Town of Flushing Burial Ground Conservancy, and we do have several representatives from them here today. So if you'd like to say anything, introduce yourselves, I'd like to invite you to do so now.
Good morning.
Good morning.
We're 5 of us that are here. My name is Robbie Garrison, and I'm the one who's been in touch with Jennifer to work on this for us. And I've been doing this with the person who was actually the chair for quite a long time, since the mid-90s, when he discovered, by going to a funeral next door to where our site is for a burial, the actual fact that there had been a cemetery for African Americans and Native Americans just across the street. And that was the beginning of his task, to have it be one of the only places in the 5 boroughs of New York City to give back a space that was once for early burials of African Americans and Native Americans. As many of you know, there is the African burial ground in Lower Manhattan, which was also discovered in era. All of the cemeteries prior to the 5 boroughs in New York City, in all of the 5 boroughs, have been covered, just covered over and used for space, landfilled and built over. And we start all the way downtown at the Colonial Burial Ground, going uptown to 14th Street, going uptown to 42nd Street where the library is, where many of you know, on into Central Park, that was Seneca Village, on uptown to Harlem. It just kept going on. So once we discovered this, it became a task of many of us in Flushing to see if we could get this back and have it be one of the few places that New York City is recognizing and have it treated as something that was. We've been here all this while in New York City, in the Bronx, in Manhattan, in Flushing. But to go to a burial site prior to the time when the boroughs were ratified, you couldn't find a burial site. Prior to the time when public cemeteries then allowed African American burials and or Native American burials, you couldn't find a site for us. So, having decided to do that, Mendingo went first to City Council. City Councilwoman Julia Harrison first. Next came City Councilman John Liu, who actually made this all happen, working with parks, working with the neighborhoods, who were vehemently against having it be even a memorial, but rather wanted a new park for children, which wasn't necessary because there was plenty of parkland around the area. So we have been working since that recovery, 10 years now on the recovery, years before that just to get it noticed. We are now at a point where we want it to be not only memorialized, we want it recognized as a national historic place as far as New York City is concerned. Yes, we have the Colonial Burial Ground, but we don't have one where after slavery, people were buried. And those of us who have traveled here, I worked long and hard with the Parks Department, and I do mean hard, because what we wanted originally was just to have 4 headstones so that it wouldn't look as if it had been a burial ground. We went through the business of having the name changed so that we would recognize every soul that had been buried there. White, black, Native American, everything, poor, rich, whatever. And we renamed it the Old Town of Flushing Burial Ground as opposed to one of those names that had been there before. So this is what we're looking for. We're looking to have in Flushing our burial ground listed as one of the historic places to visit and see that there actually was a place for us to be buried at one time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well said.
Thank you.
Okay, motion to call, if you could go to all in favor? Thank you so much for coming all the way up here.
I'm sure that some of you may know one of the people who could not be here today. His name is Henry Euler, and he's all about historical preservation.
We're moving from Flushing to the Bronx. The Saks Embroidery Company building, locally significant under criterion A in the area of industry, as an intact example of a Bronx tenant factory building. Initially constructed by the Saks Embroidery Company, a family-owned business, the building ultimately housed a range of commercial enterprises that provide insight into small-scale local manufacturing in the Bronx during the early 20th century. Although the Bronx was primarily a residential district, concentrations of small industries and manufacturers began locating in the borough by the late 19th century. The building is in this area around here. The yellow references food products and tobacco, and the red hashing is women's wear, which is the dominant industry and more extending where the factory is. Locating in the Bronx was cost-effective for employers and workers and had nearby housing, good transit, and easy access to Manhattan. Between 1912 and 1922, the number of factories in the borough more than tripled from 700 to 2,400. The Saks Embroidery Company, which specialized in embroidered medallions and monograms, was incorporated in 1901. They purchased a lot in Morrisania's industrial district the following year, commissioned architects Hamilton and Mercereau to design the building, and constructed it in 1904. Morrisania's industrial district, which developed alongside commercial and passenger rail lines, became known for its large number of small loft-style plants. Textile manufacturing, particularly millinery and lace goods, was most common. Of the more than 80 industrial buildings that occupied the area at its peak, Saks Embroidery is one of only 6 that remain. Beginning in 1913, Saks Embroidery consolidated its operations on the upper floor and leased the rest of the building to a variety of small-scale manufacturers and businesses. This strategy, which was supported by the building's flexible, open spaces, contributed to Saks' success even as the district around them began to decline during the Great Depression. Since that time, the building has continued to operate as a commercial and manufacturing tenant building. The draft was by Logan Ferguson of Powers & Company, and we do have an approved Part 1 on this one. So this is a nice little tax credit project in the Bronx. And we have a letter of support from New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission. That's Saks Embroidery.
Wade makes a motion, 50 seconds, and all in favor?
Something a little greener. We have Green Acre Park, which was constructed from 1970 to 71, and it's locally significant under criterion C in the areas of landscape architecture and community development and planning as an early and exceptional example of a mid-20th century vest pocket park. The Vest Pocket Park movement promoted the creation of small urban parks in an effort to celebrate urban life, and after decades of urban renewal and the destruction of vast swaths of urban fabric. After being introduced in Philadelphia during the early 1960s, these ideas were quickly adopted and promoted by the Park Association of New York. After she heard about the plans for Paley Park, New York City's first Vest Pocket Park, Abby Rockefeller Mauzé established the Green Acre Foundation to build and maintain Green Acre Park. The firm of Sasaki, Dawson, DeMay Architects was hired to design the park, and Harmon Goldstone was brought in as associate architect. And this is just like the best picture. So.
I love this, Jen. This is so good.
We all want that picture, right?
I
know,
It's so fun.
Hideo Sasaki, a renowned landscape architect, was known for his revolutionary, holistic approach to landscape, which encompassed principles of planning and the environment. Green Acre Park is considered one of his finest small landscapes. And these plans are great for giving you a sense of the different layers and levels of the park. It embodies the characteristics of this park type with its multi-level design, water features, multiple plantings, rich textures, concession stand, and flexible seating. It takes these features to high levels of design and workmanship. This is a fountain right at the entrance. You see the water runs down into this runnel along the side, which goes all along this seating area here, and then ends in that waterfall. The park was recognized at the time as a significant work and received awards from the New York Society of Architects, the New York State Association of Architects, and the Parks Council of New York State, among others. The park's significant design, continued successful operation, influence on later New York City zoning regulation on parks and plazas, high degree of integrity, and important place in the history of pocket parks makes this an exceptional resource. The draft was by Ms. Urix, and we have letters of support from New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission and State Senator Liz Krueger. And that is Green Acre Park.
Is it truly an acre?
I don't think so, no. You'd have to check on the acreage and the nomination.
And that's what a lot of it.
It's 217 East 51st Street in Manhattan.
With Japanese design, the green becomes so precious, and it's just such a gorgeous,
really gorgeous space.
Yeah.
Would you like to move it?
I certainly would.
Okay, Jen, you want a second? Okay, all in favor? Aye. We're going to do one more, and then we're going to take a 10-minute break, but we'll do an aye and then.
Okay.
Let me just say one thing about Mrs. Mauzé. She lived in Oyster Bay, and she was very opposed to her brother, Governor Rockefeller's project of a Rye Oyster Bay Bridge, and very quietly contributed very substantially to for the successful effort to defeat the bridge, much to Robert Moses and Nelson Rocco's rage. And he was asked about it years later, and he just said, I couldn't win if my own family was against me.
Okay, here's the lanai. Lanai is significant under criterion C in the area of architecture and design as an early yacht built and designed by John Trumpy and produced by the Mathis Yacht Building Company. Renowned boat builder John Trumpy immigrated from Norway and began working in New Jersey shipyards during the early 20th century. The John H. Mathis Company created the spin-off corporation Mathis Yacht, in which John Trumpy was a founding partner in 1910. The success of the company's first boat, Caliph, inspired more commissions, as Trumpy continually worked on new design strategies for his new breed of luxury houseboat. Each of his early boats had a unique design. Trumpy's yachts combined shallow draft structures, which allowed them to easily navigate shallow waterways, with robust engines, attractive designs, and comfortable interiors. And I just love the old yacht next to the new right there. Built in 1911, Lanai was the Mathis Company's 16th contract and 5th houseboat to be produced in the Mathis yard. The company was pleased with the design and featured the Lanai prominently in its advertisements as late as 1922. Lanai is additionally significant under criterion A in the area of recreation for its association with the development of luxury yacht recreational culture during the early 20th century. As the American leisure class developed during the late 19th and early 20th century, water recreation became a prominent activity. Wealthy individuals owned and raced yachts and were competitive in their search for more powerful boats and attractive, luxurious designs. Arthur Curtis James, the Lanai's first owner, was a lifelong yachtsman and an excellent navigator. He and his wife Harriet had home ports in Newport and Miami, where they were active in yachting culture. Arthur also worked with the YMCA in the effort to make boating and navigation more widely accessible. Under the ownership of a series of individuals, Lanai, which was renamed the Argo in 1928, remained a part of this upscale recreational culture well into the mid-20th century. And later renamed John Trumpy and Sons, the company did continue to produce boats until 1978. Few of Trumpy's pre-war yachts are still known to exist, and Lanai is the oldest known surviving example of a Mathis-built, Trumpy-designed luxury houseboat, and serves to illustrate the company's early designs and construction techniques. We did get a letter from the Landmarks Preservation Commission on this one that they said, this is really cool, but this is outside of our experience, so we'll decline to comment. They enjoyed reading this one.
Jennifer, I thought a well-done form, but a few comments, as I was mentioning to you before. On page 10, it has the New York Yacht Club being formed in 1844 in Rhode Island. Actually, it was formed in New York, right off on a schooner off the Battery. So we want to change that, I think.
Absolutely.
The other thing is that these yacht names run in families, and they continue to call to the confusion of later generations all these yachts by the same name. So the Morgans, J.P. Morgan and his Pierpont Morgan and his son, the second J.P. Jack Morgan, had 4 yachts called Corsair. Mm-hmm. And the Astors had 3 called Normal Home, which means light of the harem. What's going to tell us more about that? And
not a mixed company.
Okay. And this big industrialist, Arthur Curtis James, he had 2 lines of names, a Loa, there were 2 Loas. There were at least 4 Lanais, and it starts before this boat. No, that's what's so mad.
They just like the name.
Yeah, they just kept the name. It's like if you named every dog you ever had the same name. And so,
well, that's why they renamed this Argo in 1928. James said, we want to keep the name Lanai.
They keep the name. Yeah, so what, you know, the marine historians have to do is put in parentheses the number, you know, like Corsair, and then it'll be 3, because it was never written, of course, there's 3 on the stern. So here's the documentation for you. Lanai, I think we have to add a sentence about how this was
Sure.
and this was probably the least famous one, was a 6 meter, that's an Olympic class, and they shipped it to England and won all sorts of things. It's a historically significant line.
So how many votes have we done? Do we do votes?
We do a lot of
We've
roads, yeah.
well,
We can't
we've
go-
just done a vote in a while.
This
Yeah.
is my first vote.
Yeah, it's my first vote.
And we had Mark on staff, we had a true marine historian who was, but
I don't recall ever trying
well, he was mostly not working on yachts, but no doubt we're going to continue to see them. And it's quite wonderful. I mean, the variety today, wow. You know, look at what we've seen today. Sorry.
Kind of in line, is it, the summary paragraph doesn't mention it's renamed Argo. So when I first started reading it, I was like, Lanai, Argo, what? And then I was
Yeah.
a number of pages in before. Is
There's
that,
some confusion. I
Yeah.
cleaned up some of that based on the comments. I mean, the owner, you know, they call it Argo.
Yeah.
That's what the boat is now, but we want to use the historic name in the nomination, so we tried to be as specific to the time period when it was being called during the narrative at the time.
and that's why you don't want it in the summary right up front, that it was later renamed. It was just a matter, as a
Yeah.
reader, I got
Yeah.
confused about the different
Okay,
names.
I can
So-
take a look at that again and tweak it.
I mean, it's there later, it's just,
Yeah,
it's
it's there.
it's the
and
structure of the form.
We don't want it to be confusing and say
Right.
versus
Distracting, like you keep looking for wait,
Right.
yeah, so
Yeah.
you keep reading.
So I don't want to
Okay.
make it more confusing by suggesting it's up front, because it's not the historic name, but as a reader, I'm throwing that out.
Sure.
Whatever that's worth.
Perfect. I'll take that into consideration. We get a little.
Well, I think for the purpose of the National Arts Forum, we don't need to do that. But I do think we should have a line in there saying, you know, that Lanai was a James family name and.
Well, I didn't realize they had a Lanai before this. I
Two
knew they had
mothers
others
in that
later.
article I just gave
We can
you.
certainly note
So it
that.
starts before this and it ends after it, and that's just a good, you know,
Maybe in common name,
I mean, you could put parentheses 2. This seems to be 2 and they mentioned 3.
Yeah.
But I think more important just to get the back name and it's a family name.
Yeah.
It was used for several sailboats.
Yeah, I'm sure much of the draft was written by the current owner, and I'm not.
Yeah, I'm sure. I
aware
bet
of
the
that.
current owner doesn't know this, and there is a film coming out. I think it's going to be on Channel 13 about this Arthur Curtis James. Quite interesting. So now we're going to break for 10 minutes.
Well, you wait, vote.
Oh, we have voted. Okay, Kristen is going to move it, and she may have been just scratching her neck.
No, I'm not moving.
I'll second. All in favor?
Aye. Okay, I think we're all settled back down. So we're going to jump from city to Ulster County. This is the John H. and Sarah Trumbull House. It was built in 1876, and it's significant under criterion C at the local level as a distinctive example of picturesque residential design by architect Arthur Crooks. Trained by Robert Upjohn, Crooks had a successful New York City practice and had recently completed Kingston City Hall. John and Sarah Trumbull commissioned Crooks to design an impressive house for them at the edge of town. His design blends the Gothic Revival and the stick styles, and he carefully situated the house amid rock outcroppings. Crooks was known primarily for his ecclesiastical architecture, and the Trumbull House is one of his few residential designs. In December 1876, Crooks's design for the house was published in American Builder, which described it as a very pretty framed house. And you can see this in the plan, you won't see it in the pictures, but it's really interesting with these octagonal rooms for part of the design. The Trumbolls were active in Kingston's social and civic community and had social and familial ties to national political leaders. Sarah continued living in the home after John's death in 1881 and made plans to bequeath it to the Old Ladies' Home of Ulster County. However, the house was really unsuited to this use, and it became a boarding house for much of the 20th century. And while it falls outside of the period of significance, the nomination also notes the house's association with experimental composer and installation artist Mary Ann Amacher from 1981 to 2009. Amacher lived in and through her site-specific composition style engaged with the house musically. Future critical study of her later works may contribute greater understanding of her significance. After Amacher's death, the house sat vacant and continued to deteriorate. In 2015, Dennis and Valerie Connors, the current owners, purchased the house and have been working to repair and restore it. Dennis assembled much of the information for the nomination and aims to use the homeowner tax credit to support continued work on the house. We have a letter of support from Kingston's Mayor Stephen Noble and Assembly Member Kevin Cahill. And we have two guests here. On behalf of the house today, James Connors, Dennis' son, and David Lee, the builder. And I invite you both to say something about the house.
I brought a little show and tell here for everyone, representing the old and the new, so don't cut yourself on this now. This is a piece of oak-based trim that you basically can't get your hands on anymore, so we had to have it remilled, like pretty much everything in the house. This is the type of thing that Dave might work on a daily basis. It's part of a window frame. See how it's together there. So I've been involved with the project for about 3 years, from petitioning the city to not have the house demolished or have some other structure built there. And it's interesting, when I was there petitioning to have the house saved, it was actually in another structure that was built by Arthur Crooks, the architect who designed this house, which is City Hall in Kingston. If you don't know, Kingston was a Dutch outpost in 1641. In 1777, it became the first capital of New York State. And that was in the midst of the American Revolution. So 100 years later, it went from being a town to a city, and they needed a city hall. Arthur Crooks, who studied under Richard F. John. He immigrated from England to America in 1863 and was in the New York State National Guard during the Civil War. When he got out, he started his apprenticeship. When he finished his apprenticeship, he started his own operation in Brooklyn, and he was asked to design City Hall. 5 years later, he must have commuted upstate and downstate. He was commissioned by the Trumbolls to do this house here. The style was Gothic Revival and Italian Revival and Victorian Gothic. They're all kind of mixed together. He was a disciple of John Ruskin, who was into Italian Revival. And Kingston City Hall was actually based on the City Hall in Florence, which was actually built in 1300. And that was the Palazzo Vicci. And that was designed by Arnolfo di Cambio. So I just thought that was kind of special, that there's these group of architects designing the environment, the built environment, which, you know, is a tradition and a kind of a tribe of people that spreads, you know, over continents and centuries. So I thought that made the house kind of special. In Kingston, the City Hall and this house are the only two standing that are designed by Arthur Crooks, although he has a number of churches throughout the area in Connecticut and New York City. So that's pretty much all I have to say. Other than that, it's a really special house. You can tell just by driving around the neighborhood. The house was built on 8 acres, you know, 140 years ago, and there was basically nothing around but fruit groves and farmland. And since then, the land's been parceled away, now sits on about an acre, and semi-modern neighborhoods have sprouted up around it. And walking around there, you know, the trees are old, the house is old, and it's just kind of a window back in time, and it's a really neat place. Thank you.
I just wrote a little thing here. I've known Dennis Connors, the owner of the house, and we met in the studio of George Rickey, the sculptor, whose sculpture is down here on the plaza. And Dennis Connors is an artist himself. And let's see, I met Dennis Connors in 1993. We both worked at the studio of George Rickey, sculptor whose sculpture stands in the plaza. I live in Chatham, New York. I hadn't seen Dennis in recent years, so when he called me back in 2015 to say he had bought a house in Kingston and wondered if I would like to see it, I went to Kingston. The house hadn't been touched for years. It was late summer and you could barely see it for all the trees and shrubs and vines that had grown up around it. I wish we had that picture.
Yeah, that
you understand? Because you really couldn't see the house from the street. And you saw the picture of it before, where the facade is actually, you know, quite nice. And for the past 2.5 years, I've been commuting to Kingston to contribute what I could to its stabilization. It's like one of those structures we have all driven past in our daily commutes, abandoned, silent sentinel of past optimism. We drive past them day after day, and one day they're gone, reduced to a hole or a hole in the ground, or eventually a parking lot or a housing complex. It was that close to, it was probably a season from falling in on itself. Professional contractors had looked at it and considered it too far gone for restoration. And it took the imagination of an artist like Dennis Connors to see its possibilities. So after 2.5 years, it's been stabilized. Thinking back on it, the way it looked then and how it appears now, it calls to my mind nothing so much as the Castle of Sleeping Beauty, a Gothic revival miniature, dim and faded and mostly lost in absolutely impossible thicket, brought back to glory on its original site. On that site, and the site was near the gardens of Victor Bergevin, who was one of the earliest landscape architects of New York and of the United States. He came from France. And it's got that surrounding that also makes it very special. So stabilization of the building has been done by craftsmen who are practitioners of 19th century techniques, such as Derek McNabb, who's on the Board of Historic Preservation in Kingston, and has used the old 3-coat plaster techniques on rooms. And he's even pulled plaster crown moldings to repair places where that's fallen. And I don't know of more than 2 or 3 people in the state who can pull plaster crown moldings. It's really hard. From 1981 to 2009 was the home of Marian Auker, who was one of the foremost sound artists of the later 20th century, and a student of Caroline Stockhausen, a collaborator with John Cage. She taught at Bard College until her death in 2009, and her work continues to be performed, most recently at the Kitchen in New York City. That was this past fall. People who worked with her have said that she bought the house in part because of its acoustics, though she was not really interested in its upkeep. One person said that she liked the sound of rainwater that was funneled from the deteriorating eaves to the inside of the balloon frame walls. So that's what I have. It's a personal experience. It's been a real amazing project to work on. So thank you.
Jay makes a motion and Wayne seconds it. All in favor?
Aye. Thank you. Staying in Ulster County for the theme of art. This is the George W. Bellows House, which is significant under criterion B and C in the areas of art and architecture for its association with Bellows, the early 20th century American realist artist who designed and built it as his Woodstock summer residence in 1922. Bellows studied under Robert Henry at the New York School of Art, where he developed his skills as a realist artist and became known as one of the most prominent young members of Henry's Ashcan School. Bellows is best known for his early work, typically of boxing matches and urban life, painted in a rough, energetic, and bold style. During the 19-teens, Bellows gradually became more interested in painting landscapes and portraits and making lithographs. By this time, Bellows was well recognized for his work. The Metropolitan Museum of Art purchased one of his paintings in 1911, and he worked as one of the organizers of the 1913 Armory Show. After briefly traveling and teaching, Bellows returned to New York and became increasingly involved in Woodstock's artistic community. Inspired by the region's dramatic landscape, Bellows' family began staying in Woodstock for summer and fall in 1920. He purchased land in a section of town known as Rock City, between Woodstock's Commercial Center and the Birdcliff Artist Colony, and from April to September of 1922, built a summer home and studio with his friend, painter John Carroll. Bellows employed J. Hambridge's theory of dynamic symmetry in his design for the home, just as he did in planning his artwork. It was the only home he ever designed. And while I tried to figure out exactly all the details of dynamic symmetry, what really seems to stand out is that it's about asymmetry. So you see that a little bit here on the facade. Nothing is ever quite in kilter, which makes it a little bit interesting. And you see that here on the side elevation as well. I just love how the top windows feel like they're squished and the house is growing and moving. He also built stone walls and a bridge over a small creek next to his house that runs just north of it. And when the stream ran sufficiently, he could dam this up and create a small pool and waterfall. And on the inside, it's pretty simple and honest. This is a large gathering space on the first floor, and you see the ceilings and the walls are just plank. You can see that upstairs in the bedrooms as well. Really just a pretty simple and honest building. Feels like a summer home, feels like an artist's home. And down in the large gathering space, he built these built-in desks for himself. Well, he built one for himself, and then his daughter really wanted one. So there's this tiny little one next to it, which I wish was in the picture. Super adorable. So the paintings and lithographs that Bellows produced during his Woodstock years really reflect his growing interest in landscapes, portraits, and color systems, and demonstrate a softening of his style. Bellows played an active role in Woodstock's artistic and social communities, jurying exhibitions, managing a baseball team, and even teaching swimming lessons in the pool in his creek. Bellows hosted family, New York City visitors, and other artists at his home, which he depicted in this painting. At the height of his career, Bellows died of appendicitis in 1925 at the age of 43. The Metropolitan Museum of Art held a memorial exhibition in his honor later that year. The draft was written by Richard Hefner, the town of Woodstock historian, and this has been a great, fun one to work on. So that is the Bellows house.
Jennifer, I was curious why it wasn't listed for national significance, because it was marked as local.
So that's something that we've debated a little bit, and we were talking about. Part of what's tricky is he does have a house, the other house that he lived in New York City is still extant and listed in one of the historic districts in the city. And if he had lived longer, you know, a doctor actually told him he had appendicitis and told him to go see the doctor in New York City. Instead, he kept working feverishly in Woodstock and then died. If he'd gone to the doctor and been fixed up and had another 10 or 15 years of career where he's really starting to get into something interesting, it would be easier to make that argument for national significance.
Because that work would have been done in Woodstock.
Yeah, he's really only in Woodstock at his house for 3 years. And that's summers of 3 years.
Right.
So it makes it challenging.
Yeah. Jennifer's right. We did discuss it, and some people were pushing that we should do it. I guess I was going arguing that we shouldn't. I didn't think the Park Service would accept it. It is a whole separate period of his work. We have like 2 sites for Edward Hopper, one in Nyack and one in New York. But I guess because it was such a small period of his life, and it, you know, maybe we could have more documentation on this period of his work.
And once, you know, we could get it listed at the local level and then talk with the owner if they're interested in doing more, float it with the folks at National Historic Landmark and see what they think.
Add additional layers of significance.
I was just curious because he is a national figure.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was just curious how
if he lived even another 5 years longer.
I know. I was really mad. not going and getting his appendix out because he has pride more work like this?
The State Museum just got a 1,500 piece donation of art from the Woodstock Art Colony, including Bella's works, and the collection comes with archival material.
Oh,
maybe that's
maybe we will have more. I just, the Park Service has been very conservative lately and not a team player with us, so I was nervous about it. I didn't want it to come back, but I'd be happy to, because I know Jennifer was in favor of it, and I'd be happy to add more later, which we don't have to come back to the board or anything. We can just develop an additional layer of significance and send it.
And our art curator is currently working on a big exhibit on the Woodstock Art Colony.
Okay, so maybe we should talk and maybe connect up with all these pieces.
It's not really a judgment. I just didn't quite feel we had the support.
I find this later work really interesting too, because he's really known for that early stuff, and it's so different.
And I loved this period myself, and I was really surprised to see it. I think some of the rest of us were as well.
So it's great to know that we
Yeah.
can approve, but also consider that. So I will ask other questions.
We actually already had a.
Did you already vote while I was talking?
We haven't voted. We have the motion, so we can vote. All in favor? Aye.
Who moved it?
I did.
Who seconded it?
Okay, thank you. All right, on to the last one. I'm almost done hearing my voice. This is the New Guinea community site, which reflects the history of an early free black community in Hyde Park, which was active from circa 1790 to circa 1850. The site is significant under Criterion A in the area of ethnic history, and Criterion D for its potential to reveal more information about the lives of individuals in free black communities during the period when slavery was gradually being abolished in New York State. The period brought considerable social and economic change for African Americans, but historic records which relate to their experience are meager. The community was established on a piece of marginal land along the Crom-Elbow Creek that was subdivided and sold by the Bard family. And see it down here, these parcels here, and then this in the middle, Fredonia Lane, is the core of the community. Most families rented their land. Only one person, Primus Martin, purchased his lot, and most worked for nearby landowners in addition to farming their own land. Many were free blacks and their descendants who had formerly been enslaved by local large landowners. At its height, the community included about 60 families in and around Hyde Park. Fredonia Lane, the community's central road, remains evident on the landscape. While recent historical research offers an understanding of how free black communities function within the broad social, political, and economic life in the Hudson Valley, archaeological sites can expand our knowledge. Given the prolonged process of emancipation in New York, the New Guinea community has the potential to provide insights critical to understanding the cultural landscape of freedom in the region. Archaeological investigations completed between 2001 and 2004 identified 3 house locations and produced a wealth of domestic artifacts, including pipes, ceramics, glass bottles and drinking vessels, and faunal materials. While some focused studies have been completed, many of these artifacts remain unanalyzed. The artifacts uncovered at the New Guinea community site have the potential to reveal information about its inhabitants' daily lives, economic base, and interaction with the wider Hyde Park community, as well as the opportunity to contribute to knowledge about free black communities elsewhere in the Hudson Valley. I worked on this one in collaboration with Tim Lloyd of our office, who's here in the audience. But the bulk of the work was done by these 2 ladies here, Ann Wentworth and Melanie Moore, the authors and representatives of the Dutchess County Historical Society. So if you'd like to speak on behalf of the project.
I'm Ann Wentworth, and I'm a historical archaeologist. I was asked to initially to evaluate and re-inventory parts of the archaeological collection that had been excavated. I did not oversee the excavation. but the collection had been returned to the Historical Society as a repository. The more I learned about it, living in the Hudson Valley, I've been aware of this community, but the more I learned about it, the more excited I got about it, and the more enthusiastic I was about its significance. The historical records are meager. We've been able to find some information through census records, through oral histories that are at the FDR Roosevelt library, and also through property records. The Paramus Martin seems to have been a very important member of the community. Most of the other people who lived there were tenants, and some of the land seems to have been owned by Quakers, so there's a connection there with the Quakers and these people who were beginning their lives outside of slavery. You're probably aware that in New York State, liberation of enslaved people took place over a period from 1799 to 1827, and it was gradual. And these communities served not only as home bases for people living there, but also support systems for people who are engaging in the opportunities and challenges of being free people. It's noteworthy that a number of scholars are focusing on regional studies on communities like this. Just this year, Michael Groth published Slavery and Freedom in the Mid-Hudson Valley, which mentions this site and other sites in the area. Cheryl LaRoche has done a really important study in the Midwest on Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana sites, drawing together the historical and archaeological information about free black sites. And you're probably aware of the National Park Service recently opening the Harriet Tubman Center down in Maryland, and elucidating the geography of resistance and the landscape of resistance, that the context in which these people were living, and is very important as well. So given the paucity of information we have on some of these sites, the fact that this one is still extant to the point that you can come in there, you can see Fredonia Lane, and these 3 house sites have been located. There probably are more. It's wooded, as you can see, and it has the potential, both through the collection that's already been excavated and through further research, to help us to learn more about this period and these people.
Thank you.
I want to share the enthusiastic support of the Dutchess County Historical Society that's been working on this project since 2001, and also the town of Hyde Park. Supervisor Aileen Moore sends her enthusiastic support as well. It is on town-owned property. We're grateful for that. It offers a level of protection that we, of course, want to see in these sorts of resources. Special thanks to Tim and Jennifer for working with us. They've been terrific to work with. And lastly, I dragged Anne out of a well-deserved retirement and lured her into doing the work on this project, because we feel in Dutchess County that it's such an important project, and I needed somebody of her caliber and quality advising us as we move forward. She's done all this work pro bono, and it's just been a pleasure to work with all of them on the project. Thank you.
We would be remiss if we didn't recognize 2 members of our own Parks family. What, do you want to say anything?
Yes, I mean, those of you who, it can't be anyone in the room who doesn't know that Melody Moore was, for I don't know how many years, the stalwart and brilliant, innovative site manager at what was then called the Mills Mansion, now Scottsburg, a change that she helped to engineer. And Anne is the widow of wonderful Dennis Wentworth, who helped to run the whole Taconic region and its historic sites for many years, and was also an archaeologist. Am I right in saying that? I don't know how much time he had to spend with that when I knew him, but certainly great to see you both back in harness, so to speak.
They are staff alumni.
Questions? Motion, no questions?
Paul?
Yeah.
Okay.
Wynn and Paul?
Thank you all very much. Actually, can I say something not about this, but just I want to acknowledge Jennifer, because for the second time in a row, she's doing a significant percentage of these nominations. She's responsible for them. This is almost half, so thank you for your work. I hope you get a break for coming.
No, we have our change of the wheel.
Oh.
See what happens when you see we can. Yes, no, thank you, Jenny. You're doing an excellent job, and it's not going to stop.
Michael just pointed out there's 6 more to do in their historic districts. It's going to take some time. So I think we're going to have a working lunch. So
What time is it?
if we can, it's 1 o'clock.
Well,
We could grab our sandwiches, come right back here, and keep them.
well, yeah, we have to be done by 1:45 for the tour.
I have 2 nominations from the Finger Lakes area. The first one is the Lions Downtown Historic District in Wayne County. And this nomination is sponsored by the Lions Main Street program and funded in part with grant funding from NYSCA and the Preservation League. And I also have to say with very strong encouragement from the beginning from the Landmark Society of Western New York. Okay. Part of the impetus was spurred by the local community rallying to save 2 historic buildings on both sides of the courthouse that were being threatened with demolition. The former village of Lyons is the county seat for Wayne County, and this slide shows the government buildings around the park. The 1854 domed courthouse, the 1931 post office, and an 1872 redone in 1923 county office building in the lower left. The U.S. Post Office was individually listed as part of the U.S. Post Office MPDF in 1989. The core of the district is Broad Street, part of which is already listed as part of the Broad and Water Streets Historic District, and that was listed in 1973. It's roughly outlined in blue on the map, and the red is the nominated district. The lower left shows the portion of the listed district where Broad ends at Water Street. The nominated district extends north of Broad, beginning with the 1855 Lutheran Church, as seen in the upper left. The nominated district contains over 250 contributing resources representing the period of significance that extends from 1796, when the initial street plan was laid out, through 1967, marking the onset of a long period of population decline and decentralization of jobs and services. These images show several Greek Revival Canal-era buildings in the north section of Broad Street. William Street is the other major north-south artery, with roughly half commercial and half residential buildings. The original intent of this nomination was to promote the commercial tax credit, at least when we started the project last year. What is certain is that the majority of the contributing buildings in the nominated district are residential and will be able to take advantage of the state homeowner tax credit. The images in this slide show the residential section of William Street looking north. Canal Street is another major commercial section extending east from William Street and featuring buildings with original cast iron storefronts. The Herman Brothers complex is near the easternmost end of the nominated district. Other key streets are Butternut, seen in the upper images, and High Street in the lower images, both on the west side of the nominated district. And we'll end with Phelps Street on the west end of the east end of the district, seen what we have here is in the upper image, we have the individually listed Grace Episcopal Church complex in 1974. Below that is the trolley depot on Montezuma Street, and the lower right is the elementary school on Lawrence Street. I trust these images give you the idea of the variety of styles and types of resources contributing to the Lyons Downtown Historic District. Any questions or comments?
Wayne makes the motion, I second, all in favor? All right.
Now, my other nomination is the Live Pearl Waste Company in Syracuse in Onondaga County. This is a commercial tax credit project that received its Part 1 approval in early October of this year. The 1921 building is being listed under Criterion C as an excellent study of the industrial work of Syracuse architectural firm of Gagin & Gagin, using the concrete construction method, and that would be Julius Kahn, not Albert Kahn. And I thought it was interesting that we have two concrete construction resources being presented today. Anyway, a portion, you can see some of the construction going on in the lower left. What's interesting about this building is the exposed extender corbels intended for an expansion that never took place. And maybe a little hard to see here, but it's these items right here. So they wanted to expand it, but never got around to it, or never had the money to do it. The main factory building also has attached 1940s portions on the south and a freestanding surviving silo. And the juxtaposition of Building J, I should move back to do this, the juxtaposition of Building J and the former boiler shop in red there is a really great comparison of two types of common factory construction. The company also falls under Criterion A in the area of industry for it being one of the major industries in Syracuse that developed from the Charles Light Industrial Incubator, which is well outlined in the nomination text, and also this is part of an MPEF on industrial resources of the city of Syracuse, which is also well outlined in that. It seems like most of the industries bearing the Light name either manufactured parts for railway cars or for automobiles. For Light Railway, a fair amount of the historic fabric is still extant in the building, even with the first 3 floors of Building J previously renovated for office and retail space. Plans for Building J are to keep the retail and offices in the first 3 floors and add approximately 25 residential units of 1- and 2-bedroom apartments in the upper floors. We have a letter of support from the city of Syracuse for this nomination, and Syracuse is a certified local government. Questions, comments?
Chuck, you want to move it? Okay. Okay, second. All in favor?
Thank you.
Hi, and I get to have the last 3 nominations for today, so I will try and keep them with it fairly quick.
Well, you'd have to hurry because someone would be starving, but now that's no longer the case.
Well, my 3 nominations are 2 districts and a church, all in central New York State. And the first one is in Utica, and it's what we call Upper Genesee Street. Upper Genesee Street is south of Lower Genesee Street, which doesn't actually fit most people's idea of way up or lower works, but it's because it rises from the river. And this project was done by Wally Wheeler of Harkin Associates. He was the consultant who did most of the writing. It's based on a survey that was funded by a CLG grant to the city of Utica, and it adds almost 100 properties to the National Register. We have received one Part 1 already for a building in this area. We know that at least 2 others are in progress. And there's a 4th that may be coming in from a small building that's being rehabbed by the owners. So very much of a do it as you can afford to do it kind of project. But the people are very enthusiastic and hoping to take part in a renaissance of Utica. That complements the neighboring districts of the Lower Genesee Street Historic District, which is, as I said, north of the upper one. Bag Square East, which I think you saw 2 years ago, which was a industrial and commercial buildings district associated with the railroad, and the Rutger Steuben Park Historic District, which is very high quality residences which were built between 1825 and 1880, and it adjoins that right on the south. There are 4 listed sites already in the area. One of them, Grace Episcopal Church, for Steuben Club, the New Century Club, and the Stanley Theater. And I'll show you some pictures of those later on. And it deals with the themes of commerce, community development, and architecture for the period 1825 to 1972. And the late date comes because this is a commercial street in a city which suffered a real population decline and tried to restart itself in the 1960s. And so it tackles the issue of the impact of a mid-20th century urban renewal project on a 19th century commercial street. And so I just want you to keep these two in mind because there's sometimes the juxtaposition of the two, the old and the new, can be a little bit jarring. So I'm going to start with a map that shows you the district. And the line running kind of diagonally through it is Genesee Street, which followed a Native American path to a ford over the Mohawk River. And Utica grew in great part because it was a center of transportation for central New York State. And its height of prosperity ran from about 1875 to 1930. And it had access to national markets through the Erie Canal and through the railroad. So as it grew south of what was the Erie Canal, which is running on right in this area. This is the building bed of the Erie Canal. This is Genesee Street. And the Buckett-Steuben area, which is the houses, is down here. And as we get to the southern end of the district, you'll see that there are houses that are actually, in some cases, still extant and sometimes incorporated into buildings down there. It had really strong growth. It grew from 28,000 people in 1870 to 101,000 people in 1930. So that's where all of this is coming from and where the money is coming from to build buildings that are really quite extraordinary, quite a wonderful set of structures designed both locally and also designed by national architects. So we're starting at the lower end of the street, working our way to the north, to the south. And this is just a couple of pictures at the top that show you photographs in the 1930s and show you what the buildings look like today. And the streetscape has changed. I mean, but it's really, the feeling is still there of this being a very large shopping street, a very strong commercial center for a city. As we go down the street, we see the Adirondack Bank on the left. This building was done by a New York company, York and Sawyer, in 1922-26. And I should mention that where we started was what's called the busy corner in Utica. I don't know whether people know this term, but that was the kind of center of the downtown. And so we're working our way south from the busy corner. We have Grace Church on the upper right. We have a wonderful small building that was called the Small Building. And behind it, the Westminster Presbyterian Church, which was designed by William Ellis of Albany in 1854. And we have another wonderful little building, a triangular building there that is designed by Frederick Gouge, known also from Syracuse. So we have a lot of activity going on, a lot of people coming in to build this environment. One of the high points is the Gold Dome building, as it's known now. And it was one of the major buildings in the city when it was built around 1900, the Savings Bank of Utica by Robert William Gibson. And you can see it above when it was under construction and today as it is now. Still very much the same building, though with an addition to the side, which was added in the 60s. And then there are two streetscapes working our way south, again, the Kemp building on the right and the Stanley Theater on the other side of the street that is already, as I mentioned, listed. It's by Thomas W. Lamb in 1928. There's everything in this district. There's banks, there's churches, there's social clubs, there's, you could name it. There's hotels. It's just a great collection of buildings. Further south is the Mitchell building. This is a locally built building by Bagg and Newkirk. The Bagg family had, I think, 3 or 4 generations of architects working in the city of Utica. And then to the right of it is the New Century Club. Again, one of these converted houses, a wonderful building, but associated with an even more wonderful history. It's one of the oldest social clubs for women in New York. It was founded in 1893. It's directly across the street from the Men's Social Club, which was founded in the 1880s. On the lower left, we have the Oneida National Bank and Trust Company, and then the New York Telephone Building, which was done by a New York firm and is again is the kind of anchor to the district at the south end. And if you just look to the left, a little bit over here, you can see again, here's where houses start, the commercial district stops. And that's our boundary for the district. On some of the side streets, we also have some wonderful structures. This is the Elizabeth Street with the Oneida County Courthouse. It had been designed around 1900, was much more elaborate. It was kind of simplified and stripped in the 1960s, but still a very strong presence to the city. And across the street from it below is a series of buildings, the Central Fire Department, and oddly enough, a meat market and bakery in the red building on the left. But they're very nicely maintained. They're very well tied into the courthouse. And the two pictures on the right show us the Hotel Utica. And you can tell that the Hotel Utica must have been a success because the top picture shows it when it was first built in 1910, and it had extra stories added in 1926. And you can sort of see it's got that little bit on the top. So there were a lot of architects, as I say, active in Utica. You had Ellis, you had Richard Upjohn, you had Richard Gibson, Ulrich Franzen and Associates, George Edward Cooper, and then you had a group of local architects who came in, Lynn Kinn, Bagg and Newkirk, Albert Bagg Jr., Egbert Bagg IV, Edmund J. Booth, and Frank C. Delakees. And the latter group got involved in the urban renewal era. So here is the urban renewal. This is the other segment for which the Utica district is important. And that's the period between 1957 and 1972 when the city worked hard to reinvent itself, to establish itself give itself a lasting future. And they started out being selected as a demonstration city for urban renewal. And they were applying the ideas of Le Corbusier and the Chicago School, the differentiation of buildings by use. So they didn't want mixed use, which is, of course, what the 19th century city is really known for, is everything being podged together. Tall buildings on parkland or on podiums kind of separated out from the rest. And what they called the concentric zone theory, which said you start with the center and you work your way out. So the first project required the demolition of Utica City Hall. It was an Upjohn building built in the 1860s, and the removal of 100 buildings that were in the African-American part of the city. Needless to say, that led to protests, and after a while, the city changed its philosophy as to what it should be doing with urban renewal. So there were people trying to do commercial development, and they realized finally the city was too small to support it. So what they came up with is what we call the Civic Center Plan, which is where these buildings here, these are all plots and parcels that were associated with urban renewal, would be used for government buildings, and they would bisect the commercial section. So the very first one was the Utica City Hall, which was in this area, and this Tower of Hope, as they put it, that were built in 1961-67. The next sections were the Oriskany Plaza, which is, I don't have a photograph of, but it was a shopping area, not very successful, so they moved on to the Civic Center idea. The Oneida County Office Building is number 3, done by a local architect. The New York State Office Building, number 4, done by a Syracuse firm. And finally, Kennedy Plaza Apartments, done by Ulrich Franzen and Associates from New York, and finished in 1972. And that's why we had that as the terminal date for the period of significance. I just want to show you one final picture. As I say, sometimes I think this mix of the old and the new seems very uncomfortable. But in reality, this is what Utica looks like today. And I actually find it kind of comfortable. It creates a kind of, enclosure for the older city, and in many ways it supports it through bringing people downtown, employment, and the rest. So this is the Utica Historic District, Lower Genesee Street, Upper Genesee Street. Any questions?
Questions for the unit? Sure. Okay. All in favor? Aye.
Okay, and here's my second urban historic district, smaller city. This is the city of Oneida in Madison County. It's a city-sponsored project with Cassie Rose as the planner and Nicole Martin as the consultant. It's going to bring in 69 historic resources to the National Register. We have one letter of objection, and I think I mentioned we have one letter of objection for Utica as well. Oneida includes one listed site. It's significant in the areas of transportation and community planning. So the influences on this district are two. This red line is the outline of the district. This is the railroad running through the center of it and creating quite a different character to the north and to the south. And this area here, this line, is the Oneida Feeder Canal, which was part of the Erie Canal system, providing water to maintain the levels of the Erie Canal. And it ended up taking up the east side of Main Street and running a mill pond behind the buildings on Madison Street. So when you look at the pictures of the buildings, you'll find that there are, in the nomination, you'll see that there are kind of an odd way in which the city developed, and it's because of these now invisible features which were very historically important to the city. On the upper side, you can see the railway tracks. They were 5 lines going through in one place, so a huge barrier to the north. And then the city had its own, what we call, busy corner, in which case it was known as Madison Square, but of course, being Oneida, it was a triangle, it was a T-junction, so Madison T-junction. So here we have the Powell and Goldstein buildings at Madison Square. Upper part shows you a carnival in town. This was an area where people came and gathered. What's intriguing about this is it housed, the upper floors housed Powell and Goldstein's cigar factory. And you may have noticed that there was a Napoleon picture on the first slide. That was from the Napoleon cigars that were produced here in Oneida. 1.1 million cigars in 1884. Employed 50 people just for this one firm, and we know there were several other cigar companies around. And the factory building here, which is to the right of the other section of the Second Empire buildings, talks about being famous since 1879. So Goldstein and his cigar company were very, very important factors in the growth of Oneida. And he actually became the first mayor of the city when the city became a city in 1901. The characteristic style I should mention for these buildings is commercial in the downstairs, and then often cigar factories or usable spaces on the upper floors and residential above. So going down the street, going down Main Street, you saw the intersection with Madison Square. That takes you down Madison Street. Going down Main Street, we go from the top here, just looking south, and the picture below is south looking north. So the same set of buildings. Unfortunately, I didn't have the same order presentation. And the C.T. Walworth building, very nice building that's being well maintained in the city. The Crandall and Cree building is the southern end of the block, and there are a whole series of buildings going up, like the Masonic Temple, and then a group of banks which are above that. This particular section of the city is the old side of the feeder canal, and then to the other side is the newer section of the city. And you can see here how we have some of the bank buildings, and this is all relatively new 1920s, 1930s construction, because that's when the feeder canal was filled in. It led to the development of new buildings like the Hotel Oneida, which is 1926, also such a road reallocation, and to the conversion of the Elks Club, conversion of a house into the Elks Club, and the addition of this big concrete section at the rear to handle social events and other things that were going on in the city. So in the 1930s, Oneida was constructing new buildings on the land that had been opened up by the feeder canal, and some of the buildings that remain today are still from that period or from the earlier periods. So the canal here is probably the most important of those buildings. It was built in 1937. Myron Callett actually got his start in Oneida for his regional movie chain, and this is a building that's being used now as a civic center for the city. Below it is the Edwards building, the Reynolds block, which was kind of a public hall with upper floors and residences to the sides and commercial below. Upper right is a commercial building that fronts on both Vanderbilt and all the railway tracks. You can see this is the railway track sign, much more utilitarian. And then the end of the district, the end of the period of significance is 1968, when this municipal building was built. And it brought together the fire department, the city hall, and the police department all in one building. And it was constructed by Ted Kersey and John Rose of Syracuse. It's a very interesting city because it has these juxtapositions of dates and ages. This is one of the side streets. That's the Salvation Army Citadel on the left, and the listed post office on the right. And then finally, some utilitarian buildings. The railway section above to the north, you can see it's just different in character. Had saloons and hotels and some commercial buildings. Now, I just wanted to end this by saying that Oneida is really making a real effort to get this district on, because the Oneida City Center Committee has come into existence to both promote development and redevelopment, and the city is all behind the efforts. So we have a part one coming into the building on the right, and we've looked in the past about part one for this is the 1960s addition to the Hotel Utica. Again, very important buildings to the community, and hopefully buildings that are important to the board as well. So, any questions about that? Yes.
You mentioned there was a letter of concern. What was the issue?
It's just one property owner about it family, as we often get. People are legitimately concerned about regulation. Any other questions?
Kristen, let's go. Okay, and Paul, you want a second? All in favor? Aye.
Okay, so this is the very last one, and it's really quick. This is Wamsville Presbyterian Church in Wamsville, Madison County. It is a modified classical revival meeting house, constructed in 1832. It was modified as the patterns of worship were changed to some degree through rearrangement of the internal layout of the building, but also through additions. And it achieved its current form from 1912 to 1915. It's nominated for significance for religion as the very first religious organization in Wamsville, which started on the old Seneca Turnpike, and for architecture. And I know for a lot of people, when they look at the picture, they're really struck by the loss of the columns. But if you look at everything else, the building is as it was. It has really changed rather surprisingly little since the picture on the left was done in the 1960s and other pictures that were done at the turn of the century. This is the, again, some parts of the building that are important in terms of understanding the layout. The lantern, which has a minially built from West Troy and a short steeple. The windows originally were rectangular, and they added the Gothic elements to the top. And this is the session house that we're looking off to the west. Here again, you can see the building layout: sanctuary to the front, session room to the side, kitchen added to the side, and the top picture shows you the redesign of the sanctuary, and below is the session house. And the original church was meeting house style. It had box pews, it had a pulpit behind the tower, it had plain glass in the windows, and it still has plain glass, but they were rectangular windows. It was remodeled in 1878. The box pews were removed, became auditorium style. This pulpit was moved to the back. The whole goal was to increase the participation of the congregation in the service. So they reorganized it, they took out the box pews, put in regular seats, and this really got people singing and praising in a way that they couldn't when they were all locked into their little box pews. It's probably when the apse here in the top picture was added, and the choir loft, probably when the bell was added to the tower. The session room was added in 1891 And it gave us space for socialization in Sunday schools. And what's again interesting is this was a denominational effort by the Presbyterians to increase the congregation's involvement by not just changing the way that worship was done, but also by having people socialize with one another more within their church. So we have the session room being constructed, and that has retained kind of its characters. Well, I like these two doors because the one shows the original building, very simple, early 19th century. The other one shows the session house. So the last thing that was built on was the kitchen, and I just wanted to end with this because I think it's good for the things that we're going to do later this afternoon. The 1912 rededication speech noted that the building committee found it quite necessary to consult the ladies. This was obviously so remarkable that they put it in the speech. And this was perhaps a function of both the increasing role of women in denominational activities, but also, as we're going to see later, probably the influence of suffrage. So, with that, I give you the Wallsdale Presbyterian Church. And any questions?
Joe, will you move it?
I will.
Okay, we have a second? Jay, second. All in favor? Aye. Thank you. And now, we will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So, thank you all for attending the 170th meeting of the CFP Board. I think this is your 171st. I just want to say, as you know, we covered 23 nominations in 3 hours, and for the public to know in particular, this is the documentation and the research. There's about 1,100 pages of documentation and research that inform the presentation, so the review board has had access to for several weeks now. So thank you to the National Register staff. Kath, your unit is just clicking along ever onward. Thank you. And there's also a lot of staff that supports outside of the National Register unit that further supports these nominations. So credit to your Division for Historic Preservation in that regard. So thank you.
We have a great NR staff, and we have a lot of great consultants. And everybody is working really hard and really fast.
And we're going to join Jennifer for we don't have a motion. That's right. So moved. We have Wayne seconds. All in favor?
So we will need to leave this room completely. You're all welcome downstairs.